Hello and welcome to Mastering Meteor, Powerful Reactive Applications with Full Stack JavaScript from Pact Publishing. My name is George McKnight and I've been building web applications for more than 10 years. I've been working with the Meteor platform since shortly after it was introduced in 2012. In this course, we'll learn about Meteor while building a basic shopping cart. This shopping cart will display products by category, allow a user to add products to a shopping cart, and provide an administrative interface to users based on role for adding and removing products from the store. We'll start by introducing you to Meteor and creating our application folder structure. Then we'll move into routing and layout for single-page applications. We'll add user authentication and role-based authorization. We'll add collections and corresponding publications. We'll subscribe to our publications and query our database collections. And using Spacebars, we'll build templates and dig into the various template variables. For each template, we'll add template helpers and provide event handling. We'll secure our methods by invoking them on the server, and then we'll add various tests for our application. Once we're all done, we'll deploy locally and then on to Amazon. We'll cover troubleshooting methods for both the client and server, and finally, we'll integrate our application with PayPal and a REST API. This is a quick-moving course designed for a JavaScript developer who has a basic understanding of Meteor, HTML, and JavaScript. By the end of this course, you should understand what you need to create an enterprise-level Meteor application. Hello and welcome to this video course on Mastering Meteor. In this section, we'll take a look at how Meteor compares to the traditional request-response methodology. Then we'll add the scaffolding for our project. In this video, What is Meteor? We're going to cover the traditional request and response methods. We'll also get into Meteor and how it deals with web sockets. Then we'll touch on reactivity and mini Mongo. And then finally, we'll touch on JavaScript everywhere and how you use the same programming language on the client and the server. It helps to understand how Meteor differentiates itself when you take a look at the traditional request-response method, where basically a client or a web browser is just a dumb terminal that sends a request off to the server and receives HTML as a response. It then renders that HTML to the screen to provide a preview to the user. With Meteor, the web browser acts as a smart client by using JavaScript to communicate with the server via WebSockets. They also run a miniature version of the database, mini Mongo, to store any changes that the user makes so that they're more readily accessible. Then, any changes that are made to the server are updated on the client when the client synchronizes with the server. This gives the feeling of a more responsive interface, and it's otherwise known as latency compensation. To give you a better feel for how latency compensation appears to the user, I've prepared an example application from Meteor to show you the differences. Here we have one application on the left running in Chrome. On the right, we have the same application running in Firefox. So we're both connected to the same server. Notice on the left, when I complete one of these tasks or add a new task, the right side is updated immediately. This gives the effect that the server is pushing data to the client, when in effect, there's a synchronization going on in the background. So as we write something to the database, the synchronization then updates the local client. All of these nice features and more will be covered throughout this course. So if you go on to the next video, scaffolding, will give you a better understanding of how the Meteor folder hierarchy works. Hello and welcome back. In our previous video, we got a better understanding of how Meteor differs from the request-response methods of traditional web applications. Meteor is very flexible when it comes to files and folders. However, they do follow several guidelines and rules that you can use to your advantage. The first thing you should do is separate your folders into a client and a server folder. This is going to tell Meteor that anything inside of the client folder does not load on the server, and anything inside of the server folder does not load on the client. Which means that basically any files that are not in either one of those folders will run on both the client and the server. If you really want to stay organized, you can create a folder called both, and even though Meteor doesn't recognize that folder name, it does run anything outside of the client and server folder on both the client and the server, which means that your both folder will effectively run on both. Meteor also recognizes a folder named public, and anything in the public folder will be served to the client. So if you have images or fonts or things that you'd like to load on the client, you would place those inside of a folder named public. Now, if you have files that you'd like to load to the server, but you don't want available to the client, you can place those in a folder called private. Meteor also recognizes a folder named tests and will do nothing with that in terms of loading it on the client or the server. To keep the HTTP requests down, Meteor will take all of your JavaScript files, concatenate them together, and minify them into one file. This is a compressed file. It's much smaller and much less requests to get all of the JavaScript you need for your application. Meteor then pays attention to a load order. So templates will load before everything else. Anything starting with main will load last. Anything in the lib directory will load next. Files with a deeper path will load next, and then files are loaded in alphabetical order within that structure. We're now ready to start our application, and the first thing we're going to do is our scaffolding. So let's go into a folder that we want to create our application in, and then we're going to type Meteor create, and I'm going to call this Quiet Earth. Now that we've created the application, let's open that folder, and we see that there are 3 files created by Meteor. We're going to begin by creating our client folder and put all of our client files into that client folder. Now we can create a server folder, then we'll create our public folder, and last we'll create our both folder, where we plan to store any of the files which should load on both the client and the server. That will include our files for the router. It will also include any collections, and then the files for our accounts. Next, we should go into the client folder, and inside of the client folder, let's create a folder for our templates, where we'll place all of the file templates, our helpers, and our style sheets. These are all files that are available to the client, organized by functionality. Next, we'll go into the public folder, and there's really only one folder here, which is our images folder. And inside of our server folder, we'll put a folder for methods, for publications, and for permissions. That should include most of the files we're going to use on the server. The next thing we want to do is go into our templates folder, and we'll create some of our starting template folders. Layout is most important because it's used by our router. Next, we'll add the home template folder, the cart template folder, and lastly, the sidebar template folder. For each one of the folders that we created in our templates folder, we want to create a file which is an HTML file. Inside of that, we'll create template tags, which is basically the template with a name of cart in this example. And then for the home template, we'll do the same thing, and we'll create a template for home. So we'll basically call this home.html and create the template tags, and we'll put the word home in here so it shows up on the page. Then we'll do the same thing for our layout, and we'll create a file called layout.html, and within that file we'll create our template tags along with the word layout just so that it shows up. And lastly, we'll do the sidebar, which will create an HTML file called sidebar.html, and then inside of that file we're going to once again put the template tags along with the text sidebar inside the template. Great, so in this video we've created our entire folder structure along with some placeholders. And in this section we covered the Meteor philosophy as it pertains to the request response methods. We also covered the Meteor load order for files and folders and created the folder structure for our sample application. Let's move on to the next section, which is routing and layout. In the previous section, we defined Meteor and created our folder structure for our sample application. In this section, routing and layout, we're going to take a look at single-page applications. We'll also take a look at routing URLs and callback methods for our routes. In our first video, we'll take a look at what a single-page application is, why we use them, and why we need routing. Let's start with single-page applications. In order to understand single-page applications, you need to first look at the traditional web application structure. With a traditional web application, each page is loaded separately, and even if everything on the page is almost identical, you still need to load the entire page contents every time. This takes a little bit longer. If you were to break it out into layout regions, you could reduce the amount of load time for each page by just loading the content that is changing on each of the pages. Within Meteor, Meteor loads the template into memory, and then we can swap out sections of a page instead of the entire page. This is known as single-page web applications and routing. Let's move on to the routing URLs. Now that we've looked at single-page applications, let's take a look at routing URLs. In this video, we'll add custom packages to handle our routing. We'll define a layout with dynamic placeholders. We'll also define a route and render for each view and pass parameters to our routes. Let's start by adding the packages. Go into your packages file within the Meteor folder. Let's add Meteor hacks, flow dash layout. Now also add Meteor hacks, flow dash router and MRT bootstrap dash 3. These three packages will give us layout, routing, and styling. Now, if you look at our layout, the very first thing we need at the top is a header. So let's go into our templates folder and create a header.html. Inside of template tags, we're going to put a navigation element with a navbar, navbar-default, and navbar-fixed-top class. We'll also add a role of navigation to this element. This will help Bootstrap to recognize that it's a navigation. Inside of that navigation element, we're going to put a div with a class of container-fluid. That'll use the entire page width. Then inside of that, we'll put a div with a class of navbar-header, and we'll put an A element with an href of /admin, a class of navbar-brand, and the text Quiet Earth for our application name. Now we'll go into our layout and add that header. We'll start by placing curly braces, and inside of the curly braces an angle bracket with the name header. That should be the name of your template. Then we're going to add a div with a class of container-fluid. Inside of that, a div with a class of row. And inside of that, we'll add three separate divs, each with a different column width. We'll have a 2, an 8, and another 2. That'll give us an even number of 12. And in each of these three sections, we'd like to place a template which is dynamic. So we'll put our curly braces with our angle bracket and template.dynamic. Then we're going to copy this into all three sections. Once we have three of these, we can go and give them a label so that we're able to address them from the code. So here we'll say that the first one is called sidebar, the second one is called main, and the third one we'll call cart. So now we've divided our layout into three separate sections. Let's go into our routes.js file and add a flowrouter.route. We'll make this for /, which is the route path, and tell it that the action for this route is a return function. Inside of that function, we're going to tell it that flow layout.render and give it a layout name along with the three sections within our layout. Then we would assign a template to each one of those sections. So we have the sidebar template going on the sidebar, the home template going on the main, and the cart template going on the cart. With our header at the top, it's going to obscure the templates below. So let's go in and add a CSS file. We'll just name that app.css. And for the body, we're going to give a margin top of 70 pixels. That'll push all of our code down a little bit so that we can see the three separate columns. Now let's go style our sidebar. So inside of the sidebar template, we're going to put a UL with a list unstyled class and a side-nav class. Inside of that, we'll put a list item with a class of cursive and huge. And then inside of our list item, we're going to put an ahref with a path of /category/name, and then we'll name this example category. Because we don't have any helpers for this name, we'll just statically put the word example in there and go test it out. So here we see if we click on it, it changes our path to category/example. So now we need to go into our routes file, copy that existing route, and add one for the category. So here we'll put /category/category name. Then we'll switch the main template into the category template. Since we don't already have a category template, we'll go and make one, and we'll place that inside of our templates folder. Now here inside of the category template, we're just going to add a simple page header to let us know that we're on the correct category. So we'll put the category name call out, and then we'll go and build a helper that can provide us that call out. So here we're going to say create a JavaScript file for category, and inside of that we're going to say that the template.category.helpers category name, and then we're going to give a return function. Now in this function, we're just going to return the flowrouter.getParam and the category name. What that'll do is look at the route and see which path was supplied and pull the category name from the end of the path. We see that this now shows us example. So let's add two more categories, other example and another example, and we'll give them a different label. And now if we go and look at this, as we switch the different links, it changes our category header. Well, congratulations, you've built a layout with dynamic routes. Let's move on to the next video, which is callback methods. Hello and welcome back. This is video 2.3, callback methods. In our previous video, routing and URLs, we covered the routing steps necessary to get to your different paths. In this video, callback methods, we're going to cover the actions and parameters within a route. We'll also cover the triggers before and after routing, some of the API calls to retrieve parameters from the route, and subscription management. We'll start by going into our routes.js file, and in the route for the category name, we're going to add a subscriptions callback. In that callback, we can return the parameters to the function that we can use. And so here we're just going to put into our console so that we can see when this occurs, that the subscribe message, along with the parameters after a comma. So this will basically make sure that our subscriptions are available. So what we can do is just put a comment here to let us know why we put this here. And then we'll say triggers enter. This is another callback that's available for the routes. And we'll pass the parameters to that as well. And in here, we're going to console out that, this is enter. So we'll just put enter real big here, and then the parameters for that. And then we'll comment that as, check to make sure that the user is logged in. And then, next we'll say triggers exit, which is basically when you exit the route. So we're going to say, put the params in here. And this is going to give us a little bit of insight as to what's happening when you enter a particular route. So here we'll put exit and the parameters, and then we'll just comment that out. Down here to say check that there is no unsaved data. So that's a good thing. You could possibly check for a login on enter and that there's no unsaved data on exit. We want to define a couple other routes in here, so I'm just going to copy and paste the first home route, and we'll make one for register and one for sign in. And then we can just modify that the main section is to have the register template and the sign-in template appropriately, and then empty out the cart for both of those, and we'll get rid of the comments and change which templates are being used. So we're referencing two templates in there, one for sign-in and one for register. So we'll go ahead and make those two template HTML files and place them inside of our templates folder, inside of an appropriate sign in folder and register folder. Let's go in and fix these templates up a little bit. I'm just going to make a div with a class of row, and then inside of that we'll put a column that's 6 wide offset by 3. And inside of there we're going to put our form, and we'll call this the sign-in form. So inside of the form we're going to put a panel, and that panel is going to have a class of panel info, so it's kind of blue. And we'll put a heading at the top and an H3 inside of the heading. And then, we can give it some other classes like plain, huge, whatever. That way, we can utilize those in our CSS. So let's just take a look. See, so we have this header here that says sign in. And what we really want is a login, for them to put their login and password. So let's go below here and make another div with a class of panel body. And then inside of there, we're going to put a div with a class of form group and call LG12. That's going to say, give us a 12 unit column. And then we'll put a label with a class of plain and put email in there. And then we'll put an input with a class of form control and a class of plain and an ID of email. So now that we have that, we see we have an email here. We should go in and put one for our password. So we're going to put another div with a class of form group column LG12, and then our label with a class of plain, and the label is password, and then we're going to put an input again, which is a form control plain with an ID of password. We're going to make this a typed password so people can't see what you're typing. And then just below all of this, we're going to add a button so they can submit this form. So we'll put that in the footer, and we're just going to make a div with a class of panel footer, give a button with a button class and a button info class, and then we'll put the word sign in. Now we're going to say that this is of type submit so that when they click it, it submits the form. So we see we have a legitimate sign in form here. So we'll customize this register template by just placing a row in there, and inside of that row we'll go ahead and put a column with a width of 6, and we'll also give that a little bit of an offset. So we'll say column MD offset 3, for example. And now inside of that we'll just paste a form here for registration. I have some form code. We'll just paste that in here, and this will give us all the fields that we need. So it's basically a panel with a bunch of fields inside of the body. So if we look at that, we see we have a sign in and a registration form, and both of those are linked to their routes. So let's go into our home template, and we'll create a row inside of there as well. And then we're going to give this a jumbotron, and that's sort of a heading type thing that makes a big splash on that first page there. And just to make it more realistic, we'll add a little description here, something like soy wax candles made from the best stuff on the planet. So now if we go into our browser and we go to just slash, we see that that brings us to the home. But if we go to slash home, it does not. And we want to fix that route, because whether they go to slash or home, we want to go to the home page. So you can put array brackets here and then put two choices. So whether they go to home or slash, we end up at the same exact spot. That just about covers all of the routes that we need. I think there's one more, probably checkout. So let's go in and just copy this sign in route. We'll make one for checkout, and we're going to say that this is putting the checkout into the main section, and we'll create a template for checkout. And we're just going to put the word checkout in there for now. We'll dress that up a little bit later. Excellent work. In this section, we defined single-page applications, we've added our routing URLs, and we explored the callback methods within each of our routes. Let's move on to the next section, which is roles and authorization. Hello and welcome back. This is section 3, roles and authorization. In the last section, we touched on routing and layout. In this section, we're going to touch on Meteor authentication, utilizing the accounts package. Then we're going to touch on the user profile and avatars, and then we'll get into some roles and authorization methods. In this video, authentication, we're going to build the necessary templates for sign in, sign out, and register, and we'll handle each of the authentication methods provided by Meteor. Let's start with the registration form. If we go into our code and go into the same folder as the register HTML, we're going to create a registered JavaScript file. And in this file, we're going to put template.register.events. This is where we're going to handle any events on the form. Notice there's a form tag here as well as an email ID on one of the fields. So we're going to use that by saying submit form function, basically saying that we're handling the submit of that form. The first thing we'll do is prevent the default action, and then we're going to create a variable for the email by pulling it out of the event target, and we'll create another one, so we'll just duplicate that for the password. And here we're just going to change this event target password, and in each one of these we get the value of that field. So then we can say accounts. Now, before we can use any methods in the accounts, we actually have to make sure that the package exists. So let's go into our packages, and we're going to add accounts-password. There's several to choose from, but accounts password is the easiest to get started with. So we'll go back here and say now that we want to accounts.createUser. And this takes both the email and the password fields. So we're just going to pass the email and the password, and this should create the user as soon as they click the submit button. We're going to do a similar thing for the sign-in form. So let's go into the sign-in folder and we'll create another JavaScript called signin.js. And in this one, we're going to create a template.signin events handler. And within that, we're going to say that submit on the form. Just as we did in the last one, we're going to provide the event inside of a function, and we'll say that we want to prevent the default action, and then we're going to pull the two fields out of the form, and let's just go check that they're there. So we see there is a form tag, so we know that's going to work, and we see that there's an email and a password field. So we'll go ahead and set these up, and we'll say let's pull the email into a variable called email, and we're just going to do the event.target.email.value, and then we'll do the same thing for password, event.target.password.value. Now we're going to use a function from Meteor called login with password, and we'll pass in the email and the password. This will automatically create a session for the user who logged in, providing that that user exists. So now we're going to make sure that there is a route for signing out. Obviously, you can't sign in and out if you can't, ever log yourself out. So the way we're going to do that is in this route, we're going to put in the action meteor.logout, and then in the callback for this, we're going to say, just go ahead and go to sign in. So if there's no error on logout, then use the flow router to tell the user to go to /sign-in. That'll send them back to the sign-in page, indicating that they're no longer logged in. We can also put the flow router.go to the slash if they do log in successfully. And now that we've created all the handlers for these different functions, let's go into the header where our navigation bar is, and we're going to place in there some buttons for sign in, registration, and even sign out. And we'll start by creating a div with a class of collapse and a class of navbar dash collapse and an ID of main nav. And then within that div, we want to check whether the user is logged in or not. So we're going to put the handlebars if statement here, which says if current user, and that's a variable within Meteor. So if you're logged in, it will show a current user, otherwise it will not. And we can put an else in here as well. So we have an if current user, an else, and then we close the if loop. Now, basically, if we go inside of this if statement, we can put what we would like to show if they are logged in. And then in the else statement, we can put what we want to show if they're not logged in. So in this case, we're going to put a div with a class of navbar right and plain, and then we're going to copy that down into the else statement so that both of them kind of sit in the same sort of area. They just look a little bit different. Now here we're going to put a button, and the button class on this, in the event that they are a current user, we're going to put a little red button that says sign out, because that means they are signed in and the only thing they may want to do is sign out. So we'll put an href for sign out, and we're going to put the label sign out, and notice that we put btn-danger. That will make this button red. Now the other thing we can do is put an icon on here, which is a lock icon, and this lets us know that there's a little security thing here going on. So next we're going to go into when they are not logged in, which is the case where they may want to register or log in, and we're going to create another A element with a class of button and then btn-default and then navbar-button. That will make sure that it doesn't slide out of the navbar at the top. So then we'll say here that we want to sign in. We'll duplicate that. Spelled that wrong, so let's change sign in. And then here we're going to say register. And in both cases, we're just going to have the label indicate what it does. And then here we're going to say instead of button default, we'll give it a different color like primary. So that would make that one blue and the other one gray or something like that. So let's go take a look at this. We see our sign in, and that takes us to our sign in form. When we're signed in, we see a sign out. That's perfect. So congratulations, you've created all of the pieces necessary to do user authentication. Now, we could wrap a couple of things up, like let's take out the insecure package from our packages, and we'll add the A-lanning roles. This is in preparation for one of our next sections coming up. And we'll add one additional package, which is the Font Awesome package. That's from Fort Awesome, and we're just going to put Fort Awesome : Font Awesome. That's going to give us those nice little icons. So if we go look in the interface, you'll see on my sign out button, I have that little padlock. In this video, we've built our authentication methods and templates. Let's move on to our next video, which is user profile and avatars. Hello and welcome back. This is video 3.2, user profile and avatars. We're going to cover adding fields to the user profile, displaying those custom fields, as well as uploading and displaying an avatar for each user. Let's start by opening the register.js file and duplicating the password line. We're going to change one to first name and one to last name, and then we're going to make sure that it pulls both of those values directly from the form. Then we'll add them into our create user function, which basically passes them in as parameters to the create user function provided by Meteor. We're also going to create a file on the server, and we're going to call that startup.js. So that will run when we start the application. Notice the accounts utility methods that are available. We're going to hijack the onCreateUser function. So within that startup.js and inside of the startup function, we're going to create an accounts.onCreateUser function, and inside of that callback, which it passes some options in the user, we're going to first check to see if the user has a profile. If it does not, we're going to type user.profile equals an empty object. And that way we'll ensure that we always have an object for the user profile. Then we're going to set the user profile first name to equal the options first name, and the user profile last name to be the options last name. Now we need to return the user, otherwise you'll get an error, and I'll just show you this error here. Basically, if you don't return the user, then you'll get an error. So here in our header file, we're going to put inside of the button that says sign out, we're going to put current user.profile.firstname. And notice that we don't need to make a query to do that, and that's because Meteor already knows that the current user is whoever is logged in. And that current user now has a profile with a first and last name. So if we go look at the application, you see here that it says sign out with the name following. So let's go back into our templates and create a profile folder with a profile.html. And this is going to be so that we can edit that information as a user. So let's start out by creating a div, and we'll just make the width of that 6 units. And then inside of there, we're going to put a header. So an h2 with a class of head-snippet. And then we'll give the text user profile. That's going to be the top of our form. And then we'll create a form tag here. And inside of that, we're going to create several form groups for each one of the fields. So we'll just put 4 of those there for now. And then inside of each one of those divs, we're going to put a label and an input. So the label will give a class of control-label, and we'll say first name, and then the input, we're going to give that a ID of first name, and then we'll give it a class of control-form-control. And then we'll also give it a class of input-sm for smaller. So basically we're going to take this same idea, and obviously as a value we can already set that because it's part of the current user. So we can speed up at this point just because we're copying those fields and just replacing the names. So let's go into our routes, and we're just going to create another route, and we'll call this one profile. So basically when the user goes to /profile, we want it to perform this action. And the action is that we want flow layout to render into the layout, in the sidebar nothing, in the main section our profile template, and in the cart nothing. So now we have a route. We need to go into our header, and where we have our different links, we're going to add one for profile, and we'll label that profile. And then we'll go into our form and add a file input for our avatar. Basically, inside of a 12-unit div, we're going to put a 6-unit div, and we'll create a button so that it'll be nice and green and look like you should click on it. And then we'll put the words browse, and we'll put an input with a class like myFileInput. And now we're going to change that file or that input type to file, and we'll give it an ID of avatar, and we're going to tell it the different types of files it should accept. So we'll put .gif, .jpeg, and .png. And that pretty much keeps people from trying to upload, zip files and things like that. So now we have this sort of button looking thing with a file selector. So we can build the code for displaying the actual avatar, and that's going to be an image. And we'll give that a class of image-circle. And we're going to say that the source is equal to the current user.profile.avatar. Now that is nothing at the moment, but we still need to upload files and then store, the path to that file in the avatar field of our profile. So we're going to get into that, but for right now, we'll just put this image tag here, and we'll go ahead and give it a class of avatar-upload, just in the event that we want to style that. So for example, we can go into our CSS and put .avatar-upload, give it a margin -top and 5 pixels, and then we'll say that it has a margin left of 50 pixels. Now, we also want that image to display in our header. So inside of the header HTML, just inside of the sign out button, we're going to place an image tag in there. And we'll simply give that a source of current user.profile.avatar. Then we'll go ahead and give this an alternate of just the word avatar, and we'll add a class to this, which is image, and then image circle. That'll make this round, or basically frame it out into a circle. And then finally, we'll just add a width of 20 pixels. So basically, we've adjusted our profile to include custom fields as well as an avatar image. Now, we need to add a JavaScript file for the file upload handler. So let's make a profile.js. And in that file, we're going to go ahead and type template.profile.events. And then inside of there, we're going to handle the change event on the file input. So just put a change.myFileInput. And then inside of there, we're going to put this fs.utility.each file. So we're going to loop through every file that's found on that input. And then inside of the return, we're going to use the file to insert into the database. So here we'll say images.insert, and we'll insert that file object. Now, as a callback for this, we're able to say if there's no error, then we want this to create a user ID variable, and along with the file path that we've received from the file uploader, we're going to update the user's profile with that. So here we'll get the image URL, and we're going to set the field inside of the user's profile, so profile.avatar, to the built URL, which we happen to know is /cfs/files/images and the file object ID. So given all of that, we can now go and we're going to do this on a timeout so that it gives it a chance to finish uploading and things. And then we're going to say meteor.users.update, pass in that user ID that we have, and then we're going to set the image URL to equal the image URL object. Now, we also need to create a file in our permissions directory on the server. And this is so that we can tell the system that we want to be able to, allow everything into that collection. So we're going to say meteor.users.allow, and then we're going to just put our insert function. It just requires that there's a user ID, and then we can do the same for update, and we'll do in this case, whenever the user tries to update, we're just going to verify that the user ID is there and that the document ID is equal to the user ID. So then we'll return true. And in this case, we can just return that, since obviously the result of that user ID and doc ID is either true or false. So that's going to tell us that we're allowed to update if it's the same user that is uploading. And then in remove, we just want to verify that the user ID is there. Now, the images collection also needs an allow statement so that we can verify that whenever you try to insert into the images table. So what we'll do here is say images.allow, and on the insert function, we just want to return true. That'll give us kind of blanket access to allow the user to upload an image into the images table. So now when we upload an avatar, we should see that that is going to be allowed. So we're going to just open this up and put, update, remove, and In this case, we can also put download because the images collection does have a download function that we can allow. So basically, now if we try to change this profile, we select a different one, you notice that it changes the avatar on screen. And finally, we need to create a file inside of our collections, which is the file uploads. So basically, we're going to say var images is equal to a new fs.store.gridfs, and then we'll call that images. And that's going to create a collection for our, uploader. And providing that we've added the package, then we should actually have this available now to upload into a new collection. So we're going to say images is equal to a new FS collection, and the store is going to be that image store that we created. So let's move on to our next video, which is roles and authorization. Hello and welcome back. This is roles and authorization video 3.3. In this video, we need to lock down our application so that we can add products under a different role than the typical user. So we're going to secure the product administration, set up a role for the admin, and then add a user to that admin role. Let's start by adding an admin template. So go into your templates folder, and we're going to create a new folder called admin, and inside of there we're going to put an admin.html. We'll also create an admin.js file just so that we can put our logic. Inside of the admin HTML, we're going to put our template tags for the admin, and then we're going to proceed to build a form for adding products. So let's start out by creating a div with a column small of 6, and that's going to take the first half of the screen basically. And then inside of that first half of the screen, we're going to put a header, and that header, we'll give it a class of heading, and we'll put the text as product administration. Then just below that header, we need to add another div, and for this one, we're going to make it a form group so that we can put all of our form controls in there. We'll start out with a label and a class of control label, and then in that label, we're going to say this is the product name. Just below that, we'll put an input, and the input will be a form control, so we'll give it that class, and then we'll give it a class of input small. Now, we're just going to copy and paste this really quick so that we can finish this form. There's no point in making you watch me do the same thing, several times over. So now we have a form with a table off to the side, which is basically our admin section. Now that we have this built, we need to build a route so that we're able to get to this by going to that route. So we're going to copy this register route, and we'll just paste it up here and put admin. Now the catch here is that we want to show this admin screen, but only to some people. So we're going to do this by role, and we're going to say if the roles.user is in role, and then we're going to put admin inside of here. But before we do, we're going to pass in the user ID of the Meteor user, and that way whomever is logged in, it will check their login to see if one of the roles that they exist in is admin. If it's not, it'll go to this else statement where we'll just render, something like unauthorized. And that way we can create a template for what we want to show them in the event that they're not an administrator. So let's just go and make a quick template here called unauthorized. And then inside of that, we'll just put like an H1, a big header that says real big, unauthorized. And below that, we can put a link to send them back to home. So we'll put a /home here, and then we'll just say back to home. That way, if they end up on the unauthorized page, it's pretty quick to get back to where they started. We don't currently have any users that have an admin role attached to them. So let's go into the server, into our startup function, and we're going to find and fetch all of the users in the Meteor users list. Then we're going to loop through those users, and we're going to say that as you're looping through, let's check. And if the user's email address is equal to whoever we want to be the administrator, then we want to add this user to the role. So we're going to put roles.add users to roles. And then here we can just put user data, which is the user found, and admin. So that adds george@home.com to the admin role. Now we'll just go in and sign in as ourselves into the storefront. And basically we see this admin link up here, and when you click on it, we see the product administration. Now, if we were to create another user, let's just make this Alex, and register that user, we would see that when that user is logged in and they go to the admin, they get that unauthorized screen. So basically, what we should technically do is in the actual header, we can hide this admin link, because if they're not able to get there, it's kind of pointless to show it. However, we do have a catch-all so that if they do happen to find the admin link, it's still going to tell them that they're unauthorized. But in this case, we're not even going to show it to them. So we can say that if is in role admin, then display the admin section. Otherwise, just don't even show it. So now, if we're not logged in, you notice there's no admin link up there, but if we are logged in, it's here. And if we log in as Alex, then we don't see the admin section. Excellent work. So let's recap. We've added a route for our admin user. We added the role to our user, locked that admin route down, and then hid the link from anyone who shouldn't be accessing it. In this section, we've authenticated our application, we've added avatars, and adjusted the roles for different authorization purposes. So let's move on to our next section, which is collections and publication. Hello and welcome back. This is section 4, collections and publications. In this section, we're going to define a collection, force the server-side operations, and we're going to talk about the hooks, the helpers, and the relationships for a collection. In this video, defining a collection, we're going to start out by defining the collection, but then we're going to add a publication and subscription to the collection so that we can list our categories on the sidebar. We're going to start by creating a file for each collection. We'll start with the cart.js file. And then inside of that, we're going to say that cart is equal to a new Mongo collection, and then we're going to pass in cart. And we distinguish Mongo because other databases will soon be available. So let's create another one for products, and we're going to say that product equals new Mongo collection product. Then we'll create another one for category. So we'll make this category.js. And inside of that, we're going to say that category is equal to new Mongo collection and category. Great. So now we have 3 collections for our application, but we're not done yet. There's still more to do. You see, Meteor uses something called auto-publish to automatically publish out all of your collections all the time. And that is a relatively insecure policy. So they do that for you to get started with ease. However, removing that will make the application more secure. And once you've removed the auto-publish, now you need to define a publication for each table or collection that you'd like to have access to in your application. So let's start with the cart. We're going to type in meteor.publish cart, and then in the callback function, we'll just put a query to say, return, and then put cart.find. Now we're going to find all to begin with, but later we can put criteria in here to make sure that the publication is only returning those things that should be returned. So we'll create another one of these for category, and we're just going to say category.js here, and then inside, again, we'll put Meteor publish, and we'll put the name of the collection, or in this case, the name of the publication. So we're going to say category is the name of our publication, and its callback function should return a category.find, which will basically get us all of the categories. And we have one more to do, which is the product. So we'll go ahead and create a product.js file here in our publications folder. And we're going to say meteor.publish, and we'll place in there the product. And in the callback function, we'll say return product.find. And again, that's going to return all of the products. Obviously, we'll be able to narrow the criteria a little bit later. There's still one more thing that we need, which is the permissions. And they use something called allow and deny, which basically we're going to create a permissions file for category, for example. And then inside of here, we can say category allow. And you basically tell it how to respond to insert commands, delete commands, and update commands. So you're effectively saying, when someone asks to insert, check that there's a user ID, for example. And so you would just say return user ID. And if there is a user ID, it would return true. If there isn't, then it would return false. So it would allow if they have their user ID and they're logged in, and it would not allow if they're not. Now, the next thing that we want to do is go into our sidebar, and here we want to list the categories. And instead of just putting them statically like we did before, notice we're putting an each bracket around the first category, and you define that with a pound each and then the name of the category or the collection. So then inside of each li element, we're going to replace the static information with the dynamic name, which will pull that out of the category as it finds them. So the next thing we're going to do is create a JavaScript file for the sidebar, and inside of there we're going to define our first helper. And that helper is going to be the categories. So we're going to say that the categories is the helper, and the callback function is to return category.find. Now, keep in mind, we just did this in the publication. However, all that's doing is telling what the server should return. This is telling what of the things that are returned should be displayed to the user. So that's hard to get your head around, but we'll cover it a little bit more as we go. So basically, the next thing we want to do is in every place that we need to list categories, we need to put a subscription to that publication. Because otherwise, if we're not subscribed, it's not going to run the publication query, and we won't even have a starting set to query from. So here we're going to say Meteor subscribe to category, and then that will make sure that we have all of our categories when we're calling out to list them. So we see here that we have fruity and we have hearts. So those are being pulled from the database. We didn't type in fruity and heart in the sidebar. So that's getting pulled out of the collection using publish, subscribe, and a categories collection. Now, before we move on, we know that there are other routes which require the categories. So we can go ahead and put those in, like the category name. We still want that sidebar there when we're navigating the categories. So we should put it in there as well. Now we're subscribed in every route that needs it. Excellent work. So remember, we defined all of our collections, created a publication and a subscription, and then we listed our categories in the sidebar. Let's go to our next video, which is forcing server-side operations. Hello and welcome back. This is video 4.2, forcing server-side operations. In our previous video, we covered defining collections. In this video, we'll cover forcing server-side operations, limiting our publications, and granting permissions to different users and roles. You see, out of the box, Meteor includes a package called auto-publish, which basically means that it is going to publish every collection to every user. When you remove auto-publish, then you specifically need to publish each collection that you want to have access to in your client. So what we can do in Meteor is subscribe from the client to a publication for a particular collection. Let's take a look at how this could be a problem. So if you notice, we have all of our categories here on the left. If I go into the client and actually tell this that I want to limit the categories to only categories with the name fruity, for example, then you go back and look at the client and you see it only shows fruity. However, if you go into inspect element, you'll see that any user could just go into the console and type, find all the categories, and it'll find even the ones that you're trying to limit. So this isn't real secure in terms of what data is published to the user. Now, if we force this to the server side and we go into our publications, then we can say in the query for our publication that we want to limit our categories to fruity. And then you'll notice that it only shows the fruity category, and even if they go into their inspect element and try to run the query themselves, they're only going to get that one category. Let's force one of our methods to actually run on the server instead of on the client. And then we'll just create another template, which is the category admin template. And inside of that, we'll paste a form here with 12 units wide, and then a 6-unit section in the center, and then a button to add to the categories. So we'll put a class of add category on that button. If we were to now go to our admin template and put a call out to our category admin template, then you'll see that on our admin page, we now have a category name here with a button to add the category. So that's perfect. Now, the other thing that we want to do is within our administrative form, where we currently allow you to type in a category, we want that to be a drop-down list of categories. So we'll make that into a select and give it a name and ID of category, just like the input had. And then we're going to say that we have an each statement in here where we say each of the categories should produce this line, which is basically within this each block, we're going to put the options of the select. So we'll say that the options name and value are both the same, which are the category name. So now when we go and look into our helpers, we need to create a helper for admin. And basically we're going to say that categories is the helper, and it should return a category.find, which basically gets all the categories and displays them in a dropdown. We haven't previously needed the categories on this route, so let's go to the router, and in our route we're going to say that we want to add this subscription. And we've done that already for home, so let's just go and copy that down here to admin. So now we know that we have a subscription and we see our categories. But now this dropdown doesn't quite look right, so I believe I've left out a class. So let's go back to our admin HTML and change this form group to a form control. Now when we look at it, our dropdown looks perfect. Okay, so now the next thing that we need to do is that when we click the button here, the add category button, we would like that to actually insert into the database. So let's go back into our helpers for the categories, and we're going to make a helper or an events for category admin. Keep in mind the template name there, instead of it being template.category, it's template.category admin. And so what we're saying is that if someone clicks on something with a class of add category in the category admin template, then we then want to make this new object a category object and set the category name to equal, and we're just going to say template.find, and by class we're going to use the ID. By ID category name, we're going to get the value out of that. Now we can say Meteor call, and we're going to say add category and pass in the category. Now, we don't yet have a Meteor function on the server. This is where we're forcing this to the server to do the actual insert to the database. So we're going to create one called category.js inside of the methods. And then we're going to say Meteor methods, add a method called add category, which accepts a category. And then we're just going to say return a category dot insert, and then we'll just insert the category as it was passed to us. That way, from the client, you can send what you want to insert and format it properly on the client, but then use the server to actually insert it. Now, an interesting thing here is that because we're sending it off to the server to be done, we can first tell the server to go look and see if there's already a category with this name. And if there is, then, if as long as it doesn't exist, we want to insert a new one. But if it does exist, just leave it alone. We already have that category. So that should be perfect. So let's go in here and take out this limit on the fruity and go look at our categories. And we see that we have all of our categories here. Now let's add another one like example. So if we add that category and look in our dropdown, we see that we now have an example category available to us. But you can also see that it won't allow us to add another fruity. Excellent work. So in this video, we limited our query on the client, limited our query on the server, and then granted permissions to insert on the server. Let's move on to our next video, which is hooks, helpers, and relationships. Hello and welcome back. This is video 4.3, hooks, helpers, and relationships. In this video, we're going to take a look at collection hooks, collection helpers, and relationships between two collections. Before we start using any of this functionality, we need to add the packages. So let's go into our packages file, and we're going to add matb33 collection hooks and dburls collection helpers. You can find these in the atmosphere. Okay, so now we're ready to use those packages. Let's go into our products collection, and just below the actual declaration of the collection, we're going to say product.helpers, and we're going to make a helper called category. And all that's going to do is return the category.find1, and we're going to pass in this category ID. So providing that the product has a category ID, it will return a category object along with the actual product. So in our category.js file, we're going to put one of our hooks. And this is a category before insert function. So what this implies is that every time we do an insert into the category collection, we can force it to override that function and say things like document created at is equal to the date and a document.rating is equal to 0. And that way, every single insert will include those two fields. So let's go into our admin template and make sure that when we save a category, we're saving the ID instead of the name. We previously set that up to save the name. And then just below there, you see that we have a little table where we're going to display the products. We're going to put an each loop within this so that we can get the products out of the database, where we hard-coded this before just so we could get the look right. Now we want to add a add class for add product right here to the button. So that way we'll be able to click that button and have it add a product. Now we need a list of products to be returned, so we're going to put a products helper within our admin template JS, and that way we have a product.find being run each time it displays the admin template. Now we're going to go down here to our permissions and add a file for product.js, and we'll just copy everything out of the category.js and paste it in there so that we just have permission to insert. We'll also create a publication for our products.js. So here we're going to say, let's copy the same thing from category and then just replace this with products. So now we have a publication, we have our permissions set up, and we need to go into our route and tell it to subscribe to that. So we're going to say products list is our subscription, and it subscribes to products. And then we'll copy that both into the home and in the admin route. That way, if we're on either one of those, we can see a list of our categories and a list of our products. So the next thing that we'll do is go back to our admin.js file, and we're going to set up a couple of events. What we need to do is that when they click the button, we want it to add a product. So we're going to put click.add_product here, and the .add_product implies that, inside of the template there should be something with a class of add_product. And if they click that, which is our button, then first thing we're going to do is prevent the default action. So we don't want to try to submit a form or anything like that. We're going to make a new product object, and then we're going to say that the product object's name is the product name out of our template. Then we'll just do that for each of the fields. So we'll paste a bunch of fields in here with the same sort of find mechanism, and then we'll make a Meteor call to product insert and supply a callback function. And that way, if we want to clear the form or reset something or whatever, we can do that. But before we could do something like that, we'd actually need to have a form tag in here. So let's just go create a form tag with an ID of product form, and we'll get rid of this action stuff. And then we're going to copy the end tag to the bottom of our form, so just before the table. So now we have a product form. We can go into our callback and say that we want to select that form by ID, which is product form. And then we want to say, the first one in the array, reset. And that will reset the form that's currently being used. So then we can also say, get the field by ID, product name, and focus on that. So then every time you add a product, it will clear the form and set you back into the product name. So you could just continue to add more and more. Now let's go into our methods and create a method for inserting. So we're going to just do a products.js inside of methods. We'll create our Meteor methods function. And then within that, we're going to say products.insert, and we pass in a product, remember. So here we're going to say, product.insert, and we're going to use the product that was passed into us. So we'll just type in return product.insert, and then we'll put the product right here, and then we'll put a semicolon down here at the end. So we now have an insert function. Let's make a remove function. So we're just going to say product.remove, and we'll pass in an ID to that, and then we're going to say return product.remove, and we'll set the ID inside of that object as the ID that was being passed in. That way, back in our admin template, we can create another click event handler so that if they were to click remove product, which is that little trash can icon, we're going to say click.remove product, and then we'll say the function to handle that gets an event and a template, and inside of there we're going to say Meteor call, and we'll pass in our function name, which is product.remove, and this _ID, ._ID. So that's basically saying whatever template we're on right now, just delete that product. Now that we're actually inserting into the database, we can go to our each loop where we display the products and replace these with the names that were being placed in the database. So here we have the product name, we have the product price. Now keep in mind, this is where our relationship comes in. Category.name means that we're actually going to the category object and getting the name out of that. So if we go look, we see now that it has all of our fields. And if we were to add another product, we'll see that the name, price, category, and our remove button are all here. So basically, we'll just add one here for $23 until it's 2. And you notice it adds that in. If we hit the delete button, it deletes them. So that's perfect. We added the packages necessary for our relationships and helpers. We added a helper to our product collection, a hook for the creation date and rating, and built a relationship between our product and category. So let's move on to our next section, which is subscriptions and queries. Welcome back. This is section 5, subscriptions and queries. In the previous section, we covered collections and publications. In this section, we're going to take a look at template-based subscriptions, route-based subscriptions, and a complex query syntax. In this first video, template-based subscriptions, we'll go over how to add a subscription at the template level, then how to check for that subscription's availability within the template. So within our category JavaScript file, we're going to add a products function, and in there we're going to return the product.find. So basically what we're saying is that when you get a category, we would like to get a list of products as well. Now here's where we're going to subscribe to this. This is considered a template-based subscription. So in the onCreated function of our template, we can say that as soon as you create this template, we want you to subscribe. So we're going to say this.subscribe, and we'll give it the name of our publication, which is products. Whoops, change that. And so now we have our subscription to products, and our products should be available to us. So what we're going to do is create a new file, and we're going to make a product template so that we can independently edit this and make it, look the way that we want to within our store. So here we have a product template. So here we're going to make a div with when it's small, we want it to be 6 units, and when it's medium size, we want it to be 4 units. And inside of that, we're going to put a div with a class of thumbnail, since we're going to put a thumbnail image or a relatively large product image within that section. And then just inside of the thumbnail, we'll actually put an H4 header to describe, and we're going to center that. So basically, keep in mind when we made it SM6 and MD4, we're saying split this, in half or in quarters or whatever. And then within that, we're going to go ahead and put, a category name. So here we're basically centering the category name up at the top of our product shop. So then just below that, below the actual header itself, we're going to make a div with a class of caption. And this is where we're going to put a row. And inside of that row, we'll go ahead and put some of the things that we need. So we actually could use 2 rows here. So we're going to have one for, the product name and pricing and all that stuff. And then we'll have another one for any actions to run on this. So here we'll put right inside of that first row a column with 6 units and a header with the name of the product. And we'll come back and do the price and stuff later. But in this next row down below that, we're going to go ahead and make a div with a 6-unit column. And inside of there, we're going to put a rating system. So we'll put an icon, which is just a star, and we'll go ahead and give it a color like it's, colored in, but we'll end up removing that if they have more or less stars. So now back in our category template, we want to first check that the template subscription is ready. So you can just say if template.subscription is ready, then go ahead and do this. So basically what it's saying is don't do the rest of this unless our subscription has already come back from the database. So here we're going to loop through our product list. So we'll do an each on the products, and then within that we're going to actually, within those open and close tags, we're going to go and put a product template callout. So template that we made for product will now display here for every product that it finds. So if we go and look at this right now, we see that we have 2 boxes here. Notice that the category name is centered in the middle of the box, and we have our rating system. That's exactly what we were looking for, so that's perfect. So excellent work. We just overrode the onCreated function to add a subscription. We subscribed to a publication from within our template, and then we checked that the subscription was available before we tried rendering it. Let's move on to our next video, which is route-based subscriptions. Hello and welcome back. This is video 5.2, route-based subscriptions. In the previous video, we covered template-based subscriptions. In this video, we're going to cover route-based subscriptions and filtering by category. So let's go ahead and take out the subscription ready stuff that we put in for our template-based subscription. And now we're just going to go over to our router, and in the category name route, we're going to put a subscription back in here for our category products. Now in this one, we're passing in to the subscription another parameter. So we're going to say subscribe to category products, but then we're going to pass in params.category name. And what that'll do is that now inside of our publication, we're going to create a new publication called category products. And inside of that category products, we're going to pass in the category name. Now that we have that category name, we can return only the products that belong to that category. So first, let's get the category ID by finding the category by the name that was supplied to us, since the category ID is what's actually in the product collection. So once we have the ID of the category, we can say return product find, and then inside of the find, we can just say that the category ID is equal to the category ID that's passed into it. So this is going to limit our products by category. So as long as we pass a category name in, we should have no problem getting a list of products for that particular category. And then the next thing that we'll do is in our product template, remember we stopped short of creating the balance of that product template. So let's go ahead and add an image in here so it looks a little more interesting. And obviously we don't yet have that in the database, so I'm just going to hard code an images applecrisp16.jpg. And then we'll give this an alternate of apple crisp. And basically that'll give us a little image inside of our product shot. And then below the div that contains the name, we'll put another div here for the price. And so basically we split this into two columns, one with the name, one with the price, and that way they'll be right next to each other. So we'll put another H4 here, put a label, and this will be the actual price, and we're going to put a $sign here and take the price right out of the collection. So we see that we have all our rating stars here, and then next to that we want to put something for our button. So we'll just go ahead and put an A element with a class of button, button success, and button product, and that will be our basically buy now kind of thing. So we'll go ahead and put a span inside of here with a shopping cart so that it gives a little image or icon, and then we'll have something that we can click on. So there we go. So doesn't that look much better? We have now our fruity category with two fruity products, has a product image there, and basically that's kind of what I was looking for. So right here in this shopping cart section, we're going to go ahead and add a buy text for our button. So now we have buy on the button next to our shopping cart. And if we change categories, we see we have the products for that category. That's perfect. So in summary, we added a subscription to our route, sent the category name to filter the route, and then we displayed a list of products for a given category. Let's move on to our next video, which is complex query syntax. Hello and welcome back. This is video 5.3, complex query syntax. In the previous video, we covered route-based subscriptions. In this video, we're going to cover the query syntax, the BSON format, which is binary JSON, and CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete functions, which are available to the database. Whenever working with the database, I like to use a utility called RoboMongo. At robomongo.org, you can download this utility and use it to analyze the data within your Mongo database. Once you've downloaded this utility, you can go to the connections section and add a new connection. Put something like mini Mongo, but then the port is the only real important thing here, is that it's on localhost, and in this case it's 3001. So once you've connected to that, you can open it up and see that in Meteor, it lists all of our collections. If you open any one record, you can see how the data is stored in the database, and it's this binary JSON format. So basically binary because it recognizes types, like a number is a number and a string is a string and that sort of thing. If you wanted to check every product where the rating, is greater than 3 or something like that, you can just put a greater than and 3 here for the rating, and then when you run it, you see it only returns one record where the rating is 4. Once you've tested all of your queries in RoboMongo, you can go back to your application, and in this case, we're going to adjust our publication. So we can say where the product find query is, that we want to also specify not just the category ID, but that the rating is greater than 3. And doing so would actually affect anyone who is subscribed to this publication. You can also put criteria at the end. Like, for example, we may want to sort by the rating. So the higher the rating, at the top, or the higher the rating at the bottom, whichever, you can use this sort at the end here. So now if we go and look, we see now that we only have one returned product here, where we did have more, but only one of them has a rating greater than 3. So when we change it to 1, for example, we now see that we have a hearth product and a fruity product, both with a rating greater than 1. Let's take a quick look at the query structure, where the collection on the left can utilize criteria and modifiers to retrieve its results. Notice if we adjust the modifier, the rating, to be a -1, it's going to reverse the direction of the sort. So now it's Apple Crisp first, then Banana Supreme. If we put it back to 1, you'll see that it goes back to Banana Supreme is first, and then Apple Crisp. Once your database starts to get a lot of records, you have to begin to think about how you can optimize the database. And one thing that helps every database is an index. So with the mini Mongo inside of Meteor, you can tell a particular category that it should ensure an index on a given field. So in this case, for example, we can say that the product should ensure an index on category ID. And what that'll do is make sure that it's a whole lot faster to search for products. So that's for querying and listing, but when you go to do an update, there's a slightly different structure to the query. In this case, we can set the collection, the criteria, and the action. So we would say, for example, that a product should update where the rating is greater than 3 and set the rating to 5. And that would allow you to only set the rating on the products which already have a rating that's greater than 3. So no matter how obscure, the criteria is, you can create a method directly in your Meteor methods, like update high rating. And then inside of that function, you can do something like just update every product where instead of doing it by ID, see, normally you would say product update where the ID is equal to something, but you could also say update everything where the rating is greater than 3 and set the new rating to 5 or something. So all you would do here is say set and then rating and tell it what to set that to. So now you've sort of globally applied a update from for every product where the rating is greater than 3 to set it to 5. So that concludes this section. And in this section, we've added a subscription at the template and route levels. We displayed a filtered list of products for each category, and we performed some basic CRUD functions on a collection. Let's move on to the next section, which is templates and spacebars. Hello and welcome back. This is section 6, templates and spacebars. In the previous section, we covered subscriptions and queries. In this section, we'll cover template expressions, reusable components, helper functions, and how to use variables to manage application state. Let's get started in the first video, template expressions. We'll cover if-else statements, each statements, unless, with, and then we'll manage the HTML content within our template. Let's begin by opening up our cart template, and we're going to make a list. We'll give it a class of list unstyled, and then basically inside of that list, we're going to put all the code for our shopping cart. So the cart is going to be in the right side of the page, and here we're going to put a couple dynamic parameters. One is the image, one is the quantity. So each of those, you notice we're putting them in these double brackets, and that's going to indicate that it should take that from the data context. So once we put where we want our variable data to go, like the product and the price, next we'll actually put an each loop around these LI items so that we can say each of the cart items is our data context. So essentially we're saying, for each item in the cart, then go ahead and display this HTML and replace these variables. So now we're going to create a cart.js file, and this is where we're going to put a helper, which is going to pass us that array. We need something called cart items so we can loop through it. So we're going to say that cart items is a function, and it returns. Now normally we would just get the result from the database, but we don't yet have anything in the database, so we'll just create a dummy object so that we can see how our HTML file is going to render with the data coming from this object. So we'll give it an image, a product, and a quantity, and then a price. Those were the variables we used inside of our form. So as long as they're passed to us, normally as an array, so I'm just going to put array brackets here and then put our item. Now we'll dress this up a little bit with some CSS. So we'll go ahead and create a file which is a cart CSS file. And so inside of that file, what we want to do is make sure that those item left and item rights are going to float left and float right. Let's just make it li and then class item dash left, and we'll say float left. And then for the li item right, we're going to say that we want to float right. And that will make sure that our text is floated to the proper side. So just below that, we're going to put the item left image, and this way we can set the height of our image to, say, 45 pixels so it doesn't come in so huge. So now we see a little image of our product along with a badge showing the quantity and the name. It doesn't quite fit right, so we should probably adjust the width of this cart. So what I'll do is go back into our layout where we determine the width and set this one to 7 and this one to 3. That'll take 1 unit away from the center and give it to the right. So that opens it up a little bit. Now we have our categories off to the left. In the main section we have our products, and on the right we'll have our carts. So that looks pretty good. I think we'll put a little space here just to even out that dollars and the close box or the delete box. And then, we see that our category is here with our little buy button. So basically what I want to do now is probably go in and make sure that there is someone logged in before we try to show a cart. So again, this is another expression, and this is the if expression. And notice with an if expression, you can have an else expression. So you can say, for example, please log in, and that way, instead of having a cart there, you would have some text that says, please log in, and then they'll know they don't see their cart because they're not logged in. If they are logged in, then they'll see the cart. So basically now if we go and check this out and we sign out, and then we go and just look, and as long as we're not logged in, we don't have a cart, but if we are logged in, we do have a cart. So let's go in and add another field in here, description. And we're going to say that this field, we actually want to pass some HTML data. So we'll make like the text bold, great, and then, sent. So basically what we're doing is we're going to try to pass some HTML so that it renders HTML into our template. Now, if you notice when this refreshes, you'll see once I put the description here, it's actually going to render the HTML as HTML, which that's not really what we want. So it puts the bold tag here, kicks all of our stuff down. So we don't really want that. So if you put a third bracket here, this expression is for custom HTML. So if you want to render HTML as HTML, notice now that we have our great sent is bold. I'm just going to make this a paragraph so it breaks to the next line. And then you'll see that the great sent comes down here and the great is bold. So these were some of the different expressions that are already built in to the space bars. So you can use, if, each, unless, all of those different expressions within your templates without doing anything else. So now that we've covered the template expressions, let's move on to the next video, which is reusable components. Hello and welcome back. This is video 6.2, reusable components. In our previous video, we covered template expressions. In this video, we'll cover reusable components, component arguments, and component usage. Let's get started. First, we see in our application that we want to create a pop-up panel for our checkout screen. Now, it's very likely that we want to create many different panels throughout the application. So I'm going to create a folder here and put a file in called panel. And this panel will be a reusable panel that we can use several times throughout the application and place different content within. So to start, we'll just paste in some boilerplate code and add inside of the modal body a UI.content block. What this means is that anything inside of these tags will actually be replaced by whatever you place inside of the callout. We'll finish this by pasting in some button code in the footer. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to use this. This is now a reusable component. So let's go into our checkout template, and then in here we're going to put template callouts for panel, and then we're going to pass in the header. Remember, we made that dynamic by saying this.header. So the title will actually say checkout, and then we can close our panel. So that's enough actually to create this panel. However, we want something in that UI content block, so we're going to put something in the middle here. And we'll just put the words, checkout dialog, and that way, it'll just show something. So we can see that this becomes a reusable panel that we can use throughout our application. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to our category screen, which is where we see our products, and I'm going to put this checkout window. And basically, we'll probably trigger this by them saying, I want to check out or something, but just so that we can get a look at it, we see here's our pop-up dialog, and our header and our content are both swapped out for, the basically the variables that we passed into that. So if we wanted to reproduce this, we can just copy it, paste it. You can see that this panel now will accept anything as a new header or title and anything inside the content block. So basically we could create as many different dialogues as we want with different content and a different header. So anytime you feel like you're typing a lot to create different components, you should make them reusable components, and you can use them throughout your application. Let's move on to our next video, which is helper functions. Hello and welcome back. This is video 6.3, helper functions. In this video, we're going to take a look at template helper functions, how we can make them global so they can apply anywhere within your application, how you might pass arguments to those helper functions, and how you can use them to format data. We need to take these stars and make them accurately represent what's in the database for the rating. So to do that, we just dummied them up in our original HTML file. In this case, what we want to do is create a helper, and we're going to register a helper. Now, when you do a template.register helper out here in our client helpers, it effectively makes it a global helper so that you can use it in any template, not just one specific template. Now, if you notice, we're calling this helper ratings, and we're passing in a comparator and a value. And then we're going to return, if the value is greater than or equal to the comparator, we'll return this class price text color, which is green. Otherwise, we're not going to return any class. In our product HTML, we have the different rating stars here, and every one of them has that price text color class. What we're going to do is replace that with our helper function by saying ratings, pass in the number 1 for the first one, and then pass in the actual rating value from our template. So basically, we're going to do this once for each of those, and then we'll just change the number here. So we'll pass in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then we're going to compare that number with the actual number in the database. So see, this one has 2 stars and this one has 3. So basically, that is now representative of what's in the database. If we want to now style this, we can create a product.css file, and we can say anything with a class of FA star, the font size is half the size. And that way it'll fit on the screen, because right now it's a little bit too big. We also want to get rid of this pop-up dialog that's here. So let's just put hide there for now. We're going to do that conditionally later, but for the moment we'll just get it to disappear by putting hide there. So now we can see that this text here for the price should be currency. So we're going to make a helper for that. Let's go in and create another template.register helper. And in this one, we're going to call it currency. And basically, anytime we need to show money, we can say, use this value as the input and return, and then we'll put like a dollar sign. If you're in a different country, you can use a different country, obviously euro or something like that. But basically, you then put plus value, and we're going to put that value as a number and then say that it's too fixed to force 2 decimal places. So basically now this currency will come back as imperial currency, which basically is a dollar sign and then a decimal point with 2 zeros at the end. And now if we go to find our price, we'll take out the dollar sign and put currency in front of the word price, and basically it'll pass the price number into our helper function, and it should return with the dollar sign and then the decimal point with the 2 zeros. So that's exactly what we were looking for there. Another helper that we could use is one to truncate text, because oftentimes our text is too long and it takes up quite a bit of space. So what we're going to do is register another helper, and then in this one we're going to have input text and a string length. And the reason we're doing that is because in some places you may want to truncate it to say 15 characters, where in another you may want 30. So we're going to put our variable here shortened as the input text, and then use the JavaScript substring and pass in the start point and the end point, which is 0 and the length of the string. And then we're going to return a new Spacebars safe string. And this is a way to actually output text that is safe for the browser to render. So we'll use that as our truncate function. And if we go back to our product, there's one thing that we'd like to truncate, which is the name. And we'll play around with the numbers, but basically, we'll start out by saying, let's truncate that to 15 characters. And so if we go look at it in the browser, well, they're already shorter than 15. So let's play around with that number just a tad here, and we'll change the product as well in our cart off to the right, because that apple cinnamon might end up getting too long. So notice we could put apple cin and then cut it off. But in some cases we may want to change this so that when it does cut it off, we're going to add like a ... so that the user knows that there's additional data, we're just hiding it. And so now it puts those ... after each of the things being truncated. Now let's go back into our product and play around with this number just to see if we can get it to actually shrink that a little bit. Because see, now it's test produ, without the CT. However, it still doesn't make it small enough to fit, and anything we do doesn't seem to do that. So what we could do is potentially change the size of this so that it only takes up one line. So we'll change it from an H4 to like an H6. and that should shrink it quite a bit. So there you go. It fits all on one line now. So we've used helpers now to format some of the text in our application. Let's move on to the next video using variables for application state. Hello and welcome back. This is video 6.4 using variables for application state. In our previous video, we covered helper functions. In this video, we'll cover application state and how to manage the state of the application using session variables. In this example, we're going to use the checkout button. So in our cart, we're going to be able to click a button, and I'm going to place that button here at the bottom. We'll just put a div with a col MD12, and then inside of that, we'll put a span with a button inside. That button will give a class of btn-md and checkout button. And this way, we can access the events so that when someone clicks on that checkout button, we can do our work. The modal dialog we created is here in the category template, and this is where we have our checkout windows. So we're going to go to the category helpers, and we'll place one in here that is checking out, and that's going to be our application state. And basically what state means is that your application can be in several different states at different times. For example, you either are checking out or you're not checking out, or you can set any variable basically that changes as the state of the application changes. So here we're going to return session equals is checking out true. And what it's saying is if is checking out is equal to true, then return true, otherwise return false. And we'll start out by setting the default in this template to false. That way, our modal dialog will be hidden upon entering this template. But if the session variable is checking out is true, then it will show the dialog. And here in the cart, which is where we have our button, we're going to put a click event that if someone clicks on the button with a class of checkout button, then at this stage we want to show that modal dialog. So the way that we're going to do that is within this event handler, we're going to say set the session is checking out to true. So the only case that it's really true is when you click the checkout button. In other cases, it would be false, so you would not show that dialog. So here we're saying session set is checking out true. And then we only need to make sure that when we click the close, that it sets it back to false. But before we do that, let's go back inside of where we have our checkout template call out, and we're going to put an if statement around that that says if is checking out, then show the checkout. Otherwise, it's not going to show the checkout. So here we click that and we close it, and it basically opens and closes our dialog. Now we still have, inside of our panel example, we still have two of those because we were showing how you could put two instances. So I'm going to get rid of one of those just to clean this up a little bit, and then maybe straighten out the code just a tad. And we'll get rid of this, checkout dialog text in here. We're going to actually ultimately replace that with the checkout information. So what the list of products that were ordered and the quantities and that sort of thing. So now if we check our checkout button, it's empty, but we'll fill that in later. So that concludes this section where we used built-in template expressions. We built our own reusable components, added global helpers for formatting, managed our application state with reactive session variables. Let's move on to our next section, which is helpers and events. Hello and welcome back. This is section 7, helpers and events. In the previous section, we covered template expressions and reusable components. In this section, we're going to take a look at data context and helpers, the best practices when using these helpers, and template events. This is video 7.1, data context and helpers. In this video, we're going to take a look at data context for the individual templates and the template helpers. The data context is the information that's available to your template. So let's go and get the data from our cart. And in our user cart publication, we're going to make sure that we're finding only the cart data for an individual user, whomever is logged in. So let's go to our routes and make sure that we're subscribing to this publication. We're going to add a this.register, and we'll just say that this is cart products or user cart. And then inside of there, we're going to say Meteor subscribe, and we're going to pass in the user cart, but we're also going to send in the user ID from Meteor. And this is going to say whoever is logged in is getting passed to that subscription. So depending on who's logged in, that's the cart that you're going to see. So now in our cart, our data context, in this case, the cart items is a data context, which gives us a single cart for each list item. We're going to just change the size of this so that the cart doesn't exceed, the size of the right column. And then we notice that all of our data in here was coming from static data. We now need this to come from our collection. So we don't actually have a product object inside of the cart collection, but we do have a product ID. So what we'll do here is go into the cart collection and add a helper. And that helper is going to get the related data. So effectively, all we need to do is within the cart helper, we're going to specify something called cart product, and then that function will return the result of getting a product from the ID that's in the cart. So we'll say product find one, and we'll pass in an ID, which is this.product. And since we have a product ID in the cart, then that product ID will get us the correct product. Now we also have an image that we need to display, and in some cases that image was never uploaded. So if the image doesn't exist, we'd like to do something different. If it does exist, we're going to just return it as it is in the database. But if it doesn't exist, we'll return some, dummy image. And, normally you would put something like a not found image or something like that, but we'll just go ahead and put one of the candles that we have in our image library. So we'll put images / Apple Crisp 16 JPEG. And that will give us some image even if there's no image data in the database. The pricing information is going to come directly from the cart product. So we can just change that to cartproduct.price since the price is part of the product. So now as we add something to the cart, notice that it puts the product name, the quantity of one, and the price. Because the data is available to us either directly or indirectly, you notice that our data context can supply all the variables we need to fill out our complete template. Just to recap, in this video, we learned how to attach to the different callback methods available to each template. Let's move on to our next video, which is best practices. Hello and welcome back. This is video 7.2, best practices. In our previous video, we covered data context and helpers. In this video, we'll cover best practices with data context, with related data, and with subscriptions. Normally, when I create my JavaScript file for each of my templates, I use a macro that allows me to put all of the functions that I normally use within that JavaScript file. So here you see that we have a helpers, events, onCreated, onRendered, and onDestroyed functions. And these are all available to the template within Meteor. Let's start with this first one, the helpers. This basically implies that anything that you put in here as a helper is then available to your template. So if we just put the text something as the variable name, then we can go into the header template and put a call out for the variable name, and it should return something. So we'll just put our brackets here, and then inside of the brackets we're going to put variable name. And now if we go look at this in the browser, you'll see that a helper basically will display now in the header something. So our something text is coming from variable name, which was a variable that we placed in our JavaScript file as a helper. The next thing that you could look at, if we just go ahead and take that out of here, we can go into our events, and events manage the different things, and we're going to get into this in the next video, but basically anytime you click on something or a key is up or key down or mouse over or whatever, you can prompt the system to do something. So in this case, I'm just going to alert do something, and then we'll go put that class something on our brand logo up at the top. So that way, if I click on Quiet Earth up here, we're going to see that it alerts do something. So basically, it captured the event of clicking on an item with the class of something, and it ran our function, which was alert do something. Now on the onCreated function, this allows you within your template to do something as soon as the template has been created. So you could, for example, subscribe to your user cart and then make sure that your user cart data is always available. What's nice about template-based subscriptions is that if that is a modular template, so in other words, you plan to use it in more than one place or reuse it over and over again, you can subscribe as part of the template so it always gets the proper data without going to the route to do that. In this next section, the onRendered, this is basically as soon as the template has rendered on the screen and all of the elements are available in the DOM, you could, for example, run some jQuery plugin or do something to the data because it's now in the document object model. And then on destroyed, anytime that a template is going to be destroyed or removed, you can make sure you clean up anything else that may need to be removed at that stage. So that pretty much covers the best practices for your JavaScript file. Let's move on to our template events.
Hello and welcome back. This is video 7.3, Template Events. In the previous video, we covered the best practices with data context and helpers. In this video, we'll cover the template events, the different types of events, and how to access template fields within the event handlers.
Most web applications are centralized around the event system. So basically, when you click something in the interface, you expect it to do something. And the way they deal with that in Meteor is that if you click on something, they look for what you clicked on and check to see if there's an event handler. In this case, we have a button with a class of delete from cart. So if you were to go back into the JavaScript code for that template, the cart template, then you'll see in here that we can make an event handler that says if someone clicks on the dot delete from cart, dot meaning the class, then run this function. And you can pass in two things that are recognized, which is the event and the template. So we'll just go ahead and console log the event and the template so you can see what that looks like. So basically, if we go and click on one of these buttons, I'm going to open up the inspector and we'll click on one of these delete buttons. And you can see that there's two objects in here. There's the template event and the template object and the event object. And so you have access to all of those properties basically within that function. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And we want our delete from cart to actually delete something from the cart. So we're going to call the server and tell it to delete, to remove something from the cart collection. And so we'll just say cart.remove, and then we'll pass in, we can actually pass in this ID because this means that we're already on the object that we want to remove. So we have a cart item, and we want to remove that. So we can just pass this ID. And if you were to console log out this ID, we can go look in the console and make sure that we're getting a good ID there. So let's do our inspect element here, and then we'll click on that delete button. And you see there's an ID along with an error saying that there's no method called, cart.remove. Let's go back into our methods, and we're going to add a file called cart.js within the server methods. So here we're going to say Meteor methods, so that we're telling Meteor that we have some methods that they should recognize. And then we're going to quote cart.remove. And we're going to pass an ID into that. So all we really need to do now is say, return cart.remove remove, tell the collection to remove, and pass in the ID equals the ID that was passed. So here we're going to say underscore ID is equal to ID. And so that will delete it. Now, obviously, you may want some more validation, make sure that they're an administrator or something like that. But in this case, it's a cart, and every user should be able to remove something from their cart. So basically, we see that clicking this X allows us to delete. Now, if you look at the way event handlers work, there's an event, a selector, and a callback. And basically, the event is whether you clicked or the key up or key down, and the selector is, an ID or a class or something to that effect. So here we see the click could be many things. It could be mouse up, it could be key up, it could be mouse down. So basically, that's the event. What event was actually triggering this function to run? And if you look at like jQuery events, you can see there's the change, the click, the double click, and there's a lot of different events that can take place within the browser. And you have access to all of those. So you can say if you lose focus or if the mouse went down or, so basically, it's pretty unlimited about what they do in the interface that can trigger you to do something in your code. Let's just go check that now that we've changed this. So we'll change it to say mouse, up. And then when the mouse is up, if I just add another one into the cart here, if the mouse comes up, that's pretty much the same thing as click almost. So basically it still removes our item from the cart. So now what if this delete from cart instead of being a class was an ID? The only thing that would need to change is that in your event handler, you would change this from a dot delete from cart to a pound delete from cart. So basically this is the jQuery selector of ID. So you're saying now if the mouse is up on something with an ID of delete from cart, and let's just go check that that still works. And it does. So in this section, we've covered the data context, the helpers, and the template events. Let's move on to our next section, which is server methods. Hello and welcome back. This is section 8, server methods. In the previous section, we went over helpers and events. In this section, we're going to take a look at invoking methods from the client, securing data on the server, validation, and then CRUD functions, which do the create, read, update, and delete on our database. In this video, we'll take a look at invoking methods from the client, as well as creating a reusable method that you can call from multiple places within your template. We've done this already a few times throughout the application, where we use a Meteor call and pass in a function name like cart.remove. This is the way that you access your server-side functions, and they usually exist inside of a Meteor methods block. So this is where we put our cart.remove, and then you're able to call that. Now, if you wanted to click on multiple different things within the template and run that same function, you wouldn't want to type this code each time. So what you can do is create another function, which is like delete from cart, and pass in an ID, and then put your Meteor call inside of that other function. So you would say Meteor call cart.remove, and then replace this ID with the passed in ID. That way you could take several events, like when someone clicks on the delete button, or if there's another place that they can delete, and then all you do is call the function delete from cart and pass in this ID. And we'll see that that still works just the same as it did before. The difference is now it doesn't matter how many times you call that from different places within your interface. So you can use these Meteor methods to take away some of the more destructive functionality in the application. For example, if someone goes in and finds a product in your interface and then decides that they want to set the price of that product to $1, they could say, product update and pass in the ID of that product, and then they would just say to set, the price to $1, and quite possibly this could actually change the price. So then they could buy several of these candles from you for $1, which you don't want that to ever happen. And notice what happens here is that it says update failed, access denied. And that's because we did not place any allow validators inside of our code. So that basically restricts it so that no one is able to do that without a method. And then you can secure those methods to make sure the person who's removing something is the correct person for the job. So now we've learned how to invoke methods from the client. Let's move on to our next video, which is securing data on the server. Hello and welcome back. This is video 8.2, securing data on the server. We're going to look into securing data on the server using our accounts or roles to restrict access and locking down the user's permissions. Let's start out by going to our product allow permissions statement. Basically, we want to allow people to update the product if they're an administrator. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put an update allow statement, and then we're going to return if the user is in the admin role. So basically all we need to do here is to say roles.user. We added our roles package earlier on in one of the earlier sections. So this is already available to us. We can basically say if roles user is in role and then give the user ID and say that they're in the admin role. And what this will do is make sure that before someone tries to update the product, like the price, then we'll check to make sure that they're first an administrator. And so if we take a look inside of our inspect element here, we'll go into the console and we'll just try this. So here we're logged in as an administrator, so it allowed us to change the price to $1. However, if we sign out and let's register as a different user, this user is not going to be an administrator, so they shouldn't have the same permissions to change the product. So we'll just go ahead and create this user here. And then once we log in as this user, I'm going to go ahead and put an avatar just so that it doesn't look goofy up there. We'll select our different avatar here. And we'll pick Junior Dos Santos. So then we now have an avatar. So we now have a brand new user here, and this user is not an administrator. So let's try that same thing where we want to update the price, but now we're going to try to set it to $2. And if you notice, it says update failed, access denied, because they're not an administrator. So this is basically how you can secure, through the permissions, one of your collections. Now, another thing that we'd like to take a look at is that when a user goes to buy and they're not logged in, right now in our database, if we look, we'll see that they're actually adding quite a few entries, but the user ID is null. So we need to check to make sure that the user ID is not null before we do this. So let's get rid of all these bogus records in here. And then what we'll do is, in this case, we're going to say at the product add to cart, we're going to first check if there's no Meteor user, then effectively we want to cancel this operation. So the way you can do that is to throw a new Meteor error. And this can say something like not authorized, or you must be logged in, or something to that effect. But the basic idea being that it won't allow it. So now if we're not logged in and we try to buy a bunch of stuff, there is nothing getting added to the database because now our cart, you notice, is still empty. So this is a way that you can make sure that null users are unable to add things to the cart. Now, if I am logged in, we see that it still adds properly. So that's perfect. One other thing you want to check when you're working on your security is that if you use a passed-in user ID from the client, then basically all the client needs to do is get access to that ID, and they can do anything that you're allowing that user to do. So in this case, if you notice, what we did was changed it to this .user ID, which makes sure that it's the logged in user, not just a passed in user ID. So that's another way to secure your application. Let's move on to our next video, which is validation. Hello and welcome back. This is video 8.3, validation. In this video, we'll cover validating data types, a comprehensive schema validation, and reporting it all back to the client. So let's open up our methods for the product. And in the add to cart method, we're going to add a check. So we'll say that we're going to check that the quantity is a number. And this is going to validate that every time someone tries to add to the cart that the quantity is a number. We can also go into our JavaScript file, and just to test this, we'll switch this 1 as a number to 1 as a string. And this will show us that the system is validating this data properly, because if we try to add to our cart, it no longer works. Now, the only feedback you get for that is on the server. It tells you that the match error exists where they expected a number and they got a string. You can also make sure that every variable is checked before sending it to the server by putting in audit argument checks package. And this will make sure that anything you send to the server is always validated first. The problem with this is that a lot of the variables you're sending don't need to be validated. So I think this is just a bit harsh. So we're not going to use it in our application, but you'll see that if you have it turned on, even if you have all your variables correct, you're not able to add to the cart. And the reason is because we did not check all arguments during the publish function. So you know that by making the rules too stringent, it makes it almost impossible to add to your cart unless you've checked every single thing within the application. There's a relatively elegant package for doing this. So, we have the check where we can check if it's a number or if it's a string, but it doesn't really give any client-side feedback. If we add the package all-deed collection 2, this gives us the ability to make a more comprehensive check against our data and then report it back to the client. So what we're going to do here is go into our product collection, and then just below our helpers, we're going to put product.attach schema, and then inside of that, we're going to make it a new simple schema. And then inside of that, we're going to define the schema. So here we can say, for example, that there's a name on the product and that we want to make sure that the name is of type string and it has a label of, something like product name. And we can make sure that, that there's a maximum number of characters of 20 or something. So you can get very specific about the schema that you're attaching to this. And, we'll just put a couple more in here, like maybe we'll check that, the description and the price are correct or something like that. So we'll make sure that there's a category and it's of type string. And we'll give it a label of category. And then we'll add one more field, two more fields in this case, the description. And in the description, we're going to say that it's type string. And then we'll add price. And in its configuration, we're going to say it's type number and that the label is price. So now that we've defined this schema, we have something to validate against. But we also want to make sure that we're displaying something to the client. As you can see, it's not giving us any information currently. So let's go into the form where we do our product administration. We can see that it's giving us a clear error that the product name is required. So we just need to be able to display that somewhere. So here in our form, we're going to say, let's put a div with a class of alert and a class of message. The message is going to be what we use to access that. So here within our product insert Meteor call, we're going to say if there's an error, then go ahead and find that div with the class of message and make its HTML equal the error.reason. And then we'll add a class of danger so that it turns it, red and lets you know that there's something bad going on here. So now if we were to go and try to add something without a name, we see that the product name is required. If we try adding a name, we see that the description is required, and then the price is required. And if you don't make it a number, it'll tell you that price should be a number. So this is a more comprehensive validation, and you can get really tricky with this, but basically that should cover basic validation. Let's move on to our next video, which is CRUD functions. Hello and welcome back. This is video 8.4, CRUD functions. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Those are the basic functions for interacting with the database. We're going to go over the update method and how to update specific fields. Let's start out by going into our methods, and we're going to just comment these. This is our create function. Our remove function is the delete. So remember, CRUD is C for create, D for delete, U for update, and then there's read, which we're already doing that throughout the application. So here in our update, we don't yet have an update function. So we're going to go ahead and say, let's make an update that just updates the price and the name of a product. And that way, we can pretty much restrict the user to only updating, what they call it and how much they charge. So in this case, we're going to do an update. We pass in the ID, and then in this object, we're going to put a set method along with the parameters that we want to set. So we're going to say the price is the price and the name is the name that's being passed in. So by doing this, we now have a function that we can call product.update. Now we need to go into our client and make sure that we have everything we need to send that. So our form doesn't yet have an ID, so we're just going to make a hidden field here, and we'll put the ID of this, set the ID of this to product ID. And that way we have a way to tell which product we're actually updating. And then what we need to do is make sure that when someone clicks on the list of products that we have, then we're going to fill in the form with the data that they selected. So here we're going to say when they click update product, then we're going to pass an event and a template, and we're going to say that we want to fill in some fields. Now, so since the user has clicked something in the grid, we're going to select the field with an ID of price, and we're going to fill it in with this.price. This happens to be the current product that we've selected. So the next thing we're going to do is say name is equal to this.name, and essentially all we're doing is filling in the form that's on the screen at the moment. So the next one we'll do is product ID, and we're going to fill that in with this._ID, which is the product ID. And then we're going to change our button. So the button currently has a class of add product. We're going to select that button, and we're going to change the text on that button to equal update product. And then we're going to add a class. We'll remove the class, add product, and we're going to add a class update product. So basically what we'll do here is just chain these together. So we'll put another dot and say add class, and then we'll say in parentheses remove or update product. So since we're using update product here, we should probably change this class so that it's something more realistic, like product edit or something like that. So we'll just do product-edit. Now we need to make sure that our HTML has these classes on the different elements that we're planning to use. So here on the table row, that's the thing they're going to click on. We're going to say that we'll place the ID as the row ID, and then we're going to add the class, or better yet, product edit. And remember, this is what's going to trigger our function to fill in the form. So dot product edit means, get the element with the class of product-edit. So now if we look and we click on this, we see that we've filled in the price. The name didn't fill in, and that's because this is actually supposed to be product name instead of just name on this ID. So we'll change that to product name. And then we should see that when we select something in the grid, then we get the name filled in and the price filled in, and we have an update product button. So let's move up a little bit and make a function that actually is going to call the server to update the database. So here's when they've clicked on that update product button that we just created, we're going to tell it that we need to get all of the fields that we're using out of the form. So first, do our prevent default so that it doesn't trigger anything else to happen. Then we'll put a variable here and pull in, the field price value, and then we're going to get the name, which is the field product name, and then we're going to get the value of that, and then we'll get the ID, and that'll be a product ID, and we'll get the value of that. Now we can call our Meteor call function and say product.update, the one that we just made, and we'll say pass in the ID, pass in the price, and pass in the name. And now that function should actually allow us to update the price within our database. So if we click this and then we change the price here, we see that it changes and updates correctly in the table. So we can just keep updating this, and that's working perfectly. So let's recap. We've gone through the server methods, we've invoked methods from the client, secured data on the server, and we've validated our inputs on the server. Let's move on to the next section, which is testing your application. Hello and welcome back. In the last section, we went over server methods. In this section, we're going to take a look at testing, the different types of testing, and how to write useful tests. There are many different types of testing available to developers, but in Meteor, the main ones that we're going to focus on are the unit testing, continuous integration testing, and end-to-end testing. The first thing we're going to do is go in and add a package. And the first package that we're going to add is something named Cucumber. And basically this is XOLVIO:_Cucumber. We'll also add the velocity reporter. Now there's an HTML reporter if you want it to show up in your browser, but it's already included with Cucumber. So we'll add the console-reporter. And this is going to enable us to look at it in our development console. So now take a look here at your browser, and when the application is running and you've added the Cucumber package, you'll notice a dot appears in the upper right-hand corner. By clicking on that, it shows you that you can add some sample tests into your Cucumber library. So when we click that button and we go back into our project, we'll see that there's a test folder now, and in that test folder, we have features and fixtures. We're going to get into that a little bit deeper, but let's add our Jasmine package, which is from Sanjo, Jasmine. And by adding that, if you go back into your little dot in the corner here, we're going to see not only the Cucumber packages, but you see now it's asking us to add some tests for Jasmine. And this is going to cover all of the basic types. So basically you decide which things you want to test in your application, whether it be unit tests or integration tests or end-to-end tests. And these different tests have different purposes from within your application, but predominantly, the ones that we're going to add, I'm just going to add these in here so you can see the samples that they give you, because it gives a lot of good examples right out of the gate that you can just look at and see how they created those tests. But this is a relatively complex syntax, and until you get used to it, it takes a little bit of practice. But Let's take a look at the Jasmine folder, and you see here that they have client integration and unit testing folders. And they also have server integration and unit testing folders. Now, if you go and look inside of any of these files, you'll see the examples for the different tests where they basically have to assert some rule and then validate that that rule actually is true or false, and you're getting exactly what you're expecting. There are also more useful tests that you can make available to your application, and that concludes this video on types of testing. Let's move on to the next video, writing useful tests. Hello and welcome back. In our last video, we took a look at the different testing types. In this video, 9.2, we'll write useful tests by starting out with a plain English test and then checking that our test is working. If we take a look in our browser where the HTML reporter is running, we can see that we have a failure to begin with. And this says that basically the title does not equal intentional failure. And obviously that was created so that you could see that it is failing by default. So what we can do is go in and let's just clean this up a little bit. We're going to get rid of some of these other scenarios, and we'll start with just one so it's easy enough to recognize what's happening in the browser. So now if we go back and look, we still have exactly the same thing we did prior to deleting those things. So basically, if we now go back in here and clean up a little bit of this text at the top, we'll see basically all you need is a feature. And to describe that feature, you could say something like, as a user, I want, and we're talking about a store here. So you could say, I want to enter a profile and so that I'm recognized when I enter or something like that. So I can return. And we see that this scenario, which is the actual thing that's going to run, we're going to change this to say that I should see the title Quiet Earth. And that is the title of our document. So basically when this reruns, we see now that we're getting a successful test to run. And we can just change the description here so that we have a one-liner that says something like check my page title. And that makes a little bit more sense. So when you're looking at this in, the test reporter, you can basically see each test by name. So here we're going to say, let's make another test where we check the Save Profile button. And this is where it becomes useful, is that you're building out tests that validate certain things that are required within your application to make sure that it's always going to run properly. So, you see something like, when I navigate to /profile, then I should see the Save Profile button. And let's just copy, the sample steps. And the step that we had where we see the title, we're going to change that to say where we get to this profile. So I should see the Save Profile button. And then, we're not going to pass anything in. We know what the button is and what it should look like. So down here, we're going to get rid of this title, and we're going to use the elements, and we're going to say that, wherever there's an element, an A element with a class of Save Profile BTN, and this is going to make sure of a couple things. First, it's going to validate that we have that A element and that the class is there, because remember, we do a lot of extra logic based on the idea that there is an A element with a Save Profile BTN class, and then we hook into that in our event handlers. So we're going to say that this should eventually be equal to, and then we'll just put Save Profile. And so now if we go back out and look in the browser, we should see that our test is once again running successfully, but now there's 6 tests. So we have the first 3 where we're checking the user when we navigate to /, and then when we check the user, navigate to profile, and then we should see a Save Profile button. Let's break this. So we're going to come in here and say, let's save profile, and spell it wrong. And basically, what we're doing here is saying, okay, well, why does this not work? And it basically says that it expects it to equal Save Profile. So, you can validate different things like the text on the button, or any element in the document actually exists when you go to a specific location. And so this is a useful way to make sure you're calling tests that are going to prove that your application is working. So in this section, we defined the main testing types, added a package, defined a test step to execute, and then defined a feature to call on that step. In our next section, we're going to go over deploying our application. Hello and welcome back. This is section 10, deploying your application. In the last section, we covered testing and types of tests. In this section, we'll cover deploying locally, deploying to the Meteor server, deploying to Amazon, and updating your deployed application. In this video, 10.1, we'll be deploying our application locally and going over some of the terminal commands you can use when doing so. Deploying your application locally basically means that you are running the application on the same server you're developing on. In this case, we can just use the command Meteor or Meteor run. So if you were to go into your terminal and type in Meteor run, then you'll see that it starts up your application. This is what we've been doing all along. Using Meteor or Meteor run will automatically run the testing framework if it's installed. However, sometimes when you run this application in production, you don't want to include that testing. So you can supply a command like meteor -- production run. Including the production flag tells Meteor to run your application as if it were in production. So you obviously don't want to show your users any testing. One thing you'll notice with a community like Meteor, many of the packages actually get outdated or they no longer work with another package or version of Meteor. So you can run Meteor at a specific release. For this course, we've been using release 1.1.0.3. So if you're having trouble with any of the packages, it may be that they've released a new version that's broken something. So the best thing you could do is say Meteor update and then -- release, then 1.1.0.3. And that will force your Meteor to run at the version that we created this course on. You can also specify that packages run at a specific version. So if you notice that it's only one package preventing you from updating, you can specify an @ sign after any package name and the version, and it will make sure to run at that version. Here I put in my configuration so that whenever Meteor starts, it starts at release 1.1.0.3. You can also say that Meteor should update to that version. Now, Meteor also has some other commands in the console like the port. You could specify the port, or you could list all of the packages you're using, for example. And these console commands are very important to learn. So you can see all the packages you have and what their purposes are. And if you want more information, you can type in Meteor show and then type the package name. So for example, you could say Meteor hacks : flow router, and this would give us additional information about that package, like which recent versions were published. And you'll notice little notes at the top like use Kadira flow router instead of this version. So they've updated this and want us to update to the new version. Now, that's a rather brave thing to do if you're always updating all your packages. But in this case, I know that this doesn't really have a bad impact on the application. So we'll go ahead and change that from Kadira to Kadira flow - router. And now if you type Meteor help, you'll notice that there's a list of all the shell commands that are available to you, so that when you type Meteor, you can type Meteor reset or Meteor logs or Meteor claim. And basically you can read what each of these things do, but they're very useful for running Meteor applications. Now, Meteor run is probably the most used command within the console, and that will just start up your application. Let's move on to the next video, which is deploying to the Meteor server. Hello and welcome back. This is video 10.2, deploying to the Meteor server. In our previous video, we deployed our application locally. In this video, we'll deploy our application to the Meteor hosting site. Meteor provides a free service where any of the Meteor developers are able to deploy their applications to their hosted server. So here I'm going to say Meteor deploy quietearth.meteor.com. And you notice that you have to put the .meteor.com at the end after your application name. It'll ask you for an email, which has to be a registered developer account. And you need to make sure you type in the correct email and password, and then it will publish your application under your Meteor developer account. Now, if we were to go to the http quietearth.meteor.com, we'll see that Meteor has published our application out on the web. So we're able to test our application on the web. This is great for testing, but I wouldn't use it in production. Meteor makes no guarantees as to the availability of the server at any given time. If you want something like that, you'll have to use Meteor Galaxy, and you can look further into that on the Meteor website. If you don't already have a developer's account, you can go directly to the Meteor website, and you'll see in the upper right-hand corner where you're able to log in, you can create an account, or you can sign into an existing account. In this case, I'm just going to use my login, and I'll show you that once you have a developer account, you have a different sort of dashboard that allows you to see all of the different documentation and specify anything that you'd like to do with the Meteor developer account. Now, if you look under services, you'll see Galaxy, and basically you can read all about what Galaxy is and what it does for you. That's Meteor's main product line, which is basically this ability to host your applications and provide enterprise level support on those applications. If you read the frequently asked questions, you can see a lot of the questions that you probably have are already answered on there. So now that we've deployed our application to the Meteor site, let's move on to the next video, which is deploying to the Amazon EC2 instance. Hello and welcome back. This is video 10.3, deploying to an Amazon EC2 instance. In our previous video, we deployed to the Meteor hosting site. In this video, we'll create an Amazon account, add an EC2 instance, and deploy our application using Meteor Up. If you already have an account with Amazon, you can just log in using your existing login. Otherwise, you'll need to do the I am a new user and then give a password and do everything you need to set that up. Once you've created an account with Amazon, you can log in with your password and it'll bring you into a console. And in that console, you'll see EC2. If you click on that, you can choose to launch an instance of a web server. And here we're going to pick the Ubuntu server. It's a Linux-based server. And then we're going to launch that. And the first thing we'll do is edit our security groups. I have an existing security group, but basically all it is that it has an HTTP, an SSH, and an HTTPS entry in the inbound connections. Most of this is specific to Amazon, so you can look at their documentation if you want more details. But in this instance, we're going to go ahead and launch the instance using these security settings. Notice that it asks us to select a key pair. They would have required that you set that up in order to create the instance. Now, once you've done that, you're able to see that your instance is now launching. So from this stage, you can say that you want to go and view the instance, and you'll see that instance starting up. Let's give ours a name like QE for Quiet Earth and then store. And once we do that, we see that it says it's running, and you'll look down here and see the public DNS. Let's copy that because we're going to use that later. Now go into your project within your IDE, and here we're going to say npm space minus, and actually I'm going to use sudo because I want it to be unrestricted in terms of copying files. And then we're going to say sudo npm install -g for all users MUP. And then it will ask you for your password on your computer so that it can copy files to, secure directories. Then basically it copies all of those files and you just type in mup init. And you'll notice that it creates two files in your project, a mup.json file and a settings.json file. We're not going to deal with the settings right now. Let's just first go in and change the root URL to that URL that we copied and the host server to that. Now, we also changed the username to Ubuntu and our password we're going to comment out. Because you've downloaded a PEM file, which this was a requirement by Amazon, you're going to see that you can now specify the path to where that file exists on your local box. This is going to tell it which security settings to use when it logs in. Then you don't need a password at all. And then we'll give it the application name, which we called it Quiet Earth, and the path to where we stored the application. I moved it to my root directory for simplicity's sake. So now we have an application called Quiet Earth on the root of our drive. We can say mup setup, and it'll go through all the steps in order to create, an install node and, some of the different configuration utilities that they use and things like that. So after it's completed all of this, you'll see that you can then type in mup deploy, and this will deploy your application onto the Amazon EC2 instance. You can go to the MUP website to find more information if you're experiencing any errors at any of these steps. But if you do everything as we've outlined it in this video, you shouldn't have any problems since this is happening on a remote server and not your own. So here we see now that our application is running. And if you look at the URL, it's on Amazon. So now that we've deployed our application on our Amazon instance, let's move on to the next video, which is updating your deployed application. Hello and welcome back. This is video 10.4, Update Your Deployed Application. In our previous video, we deployed our application to an Amazon EC2 instance. In this video, we're going to update our deployed application using the Meteor Up tool. Before we get started, it's important to recognize that we have a startup function that automatically assigns an email address to the role admin. We're going to need that when we deploy our application so we can make sure to populate the database with the proper products so that we can do our checkouts and things like that. So make sure that you log in as that user that you specified, and then you can begin to add your categories and products and things of that nature. If you log in as someone other than that, you won't see the admin functions and you won't be able to add products or categories. Updating your deployed application is as easy as redeploying the application. So once you've made any changes, you can simply go in and say mup deploy, and that will re-upload everything that you've changed in your application. So any changes that you make will just be recompiled and basically sent back up to your Amazon EC2 instance. Now, sometimes the Amazon instances have changed or the MUP utility changes, so you'll need to do an update of the MUP utility or the Meteor Up utility. And you can do that by simply typing sudo npm update -g mup and then supplying a password. This is going to update the utility on your computer so that you have the latest Meteor Up utility for deploying your applications. If you type Meteor Setup over again, it will basically reset up the Meteor server so that you effectively get rid of any of the configuration settings you had previously and re-upload that configuration file and reset the application up with those new settings. So this is a great utility for when something has changed in the Meteor Up utility or you've got a new instance name or something like that, and then you can just type in Meteor or MUP setup. So in this section, we've deployed our application locally, deployed it to the Meteor server, deployed it to Amazon, and updated our Amazon deployment. Hello and welcome back. This is section 11, Troubleshooting Meteor. In the previous section, we covered deploying your application. In this section, we're going to take a look at client debugging as well as server debugging. And in this video, we'll cover debugging the client code. Let's start with client debugging. Probably the most useful command within the JavaScript front end is the console. Console log allows you to put something like a string like enter and an object like params into the code so that when you look at it in the developer's console of your browser, whether that be Safari, Firefox, or Chrome in our case, you'll see when it reaches that point in the code, the text and the objects that you've added to the console. So let's take a look at our inspect element and go to the console. And then we'll go and click on this so that we can see our enter and then our object. And inside of our object, it has all of the parameters and what they're currently set to. This is the easiest way to find a problem when you have something running in your code that isn't working out right. So you can just put a console message to tell you that, we just entered or we did this. And you can have many, many console messages that you can look at. You can also inspect element by right-clicking on any element in your page and seeing the actual HTML markup. So here we see, for example, that we have a label with a class of badge. And here it shows us where we're getting the CSS from. So essentially, you can right-click on something, inspect element to see its HTML markup and CSS, and then you can even use the console to address those different pieces and make sure that, for example, jQuery is working. So we can say for selector of label.badge, and we see that our badge is there. Now we can even set that. It's not going to do anything to the database or to our markup, but it will, on this instance of the page, show us that we can change that 1 to a 4. That's a good way to find out if your application is trying to do that, why it wouldn't work. Maybe you get an error or something to that effect. So the other options are, of course, in the terminal. You can go into your terminal on your computer, whether that be in your IDE or outside on the terminal. But basically, you can go into the console, and there is a shell supplied by Meteor. So we'll just go to another terminal window here, and we're going to say Meteor shell. And what that'll do is open it up into this interface where basically if you type something and then tab, it'll show you all the things you can type. So in this example, the Meteor shell shows us just by typing meteor.tab, we can see all of the different commands that we could check to see if it's a function or what it is that this thing is supposed to be. For example, if we say get, it's a function. If we say something like meteor.server, on the other hand, then this would show us all of the settings for the server currently. So this is another way to find information that you're looking for that might otherwise be hidden. So basically, the shell is a useful utility that Meteor has added to give you some sort of window into the functions and things that they're using from within the application. Meteor supplies another useful utility for debugging, which is the debugger command. You can go anywhere within code and tell it that when it executes this particular portion of code, that you want it to break into the debugger. And just by putting the word debugger into your code, then running this with the console open will automatically stop the application at that point. So for example, if we now go back into our browser and we refresh this page, you'll see that it's going to break into our console and allow us to basically see where we are exactly in that spot where you've placed the debugger command. So here we see section equals is checking out and 0, So effectively, this will allow us to then step through those different functions. And you can tell it that you want to, for example, set one of these parameters as a watch statement or a watch expression. You can set breakpoints anywhere in the code as you look at it. And this is something to get used to, but it's a great utility to add these debugger commands when you're having problems. and then to go step through the code and find where the execution of that code might be failing in your application. So those are the main tools that we have available to us for client-side debugging. Let's go to our next video, which is server debugging. Hello and welcome back. This is video 11.2, server debugging. In our previous video, we covered debugging on the client side or in the browser. In this video, we'll cover server-side debugging. Much like the client debugging tools, there's a console log that works on the server as well. So if you simply go anywhere inside your server code, like this category.js file, for example, inside of a server method, you can console out some text as well as an object. So in this example, we send in a category with a category name. We can put send to category, comma, and then the category that's passed in. If we then run that in our browser, we'll be able to see, instead of looking in the browser's console, you look in the IDE or the terminal where you're running Meteor, and you'll see all of those show up in the console. For example, if we type a category like fruity into the category name and then press the add category button, we can go back to our IDE and open up our terminal window, and we'll notice that the send to add category with an object and a name of fruity is supplied in the terminal. We can also add a debugger statement here inside of the method. And by placing that debugger statement, then when you start Meteor with debug, it will immediately stop inside of the debugger. So we're going to use this URL that they supply us. We'll go into our browser and open another tab. And in that tab, we'll put that URL they gave us, which will bring us directly to the debugger. We'll tell that to continue, and then we're just going to refresh our application. And once this becomes available, we can go in and add a category, and it will break into that debugger statement, just where we place the debug. So if we look here, we're going to add something, and we'll just call this like other and hit add category. And then you see that it stops here at our debugger statement, right at the send to add category. We see the parameters that were supplied to the function, and you can tell it to step over each of these functions so that you could walk through the code and see exactly what the parameters are at different given points, and then determine whether or not that's a problem for the application. So we've covered some simple debugging on the client side and the server side. Let's move into the next section, which is integrating other frameworks. Hello and welcome back. This is section 12, integrating other frameworks. In the previous section, we covered client and server-side debugging. In this section, we'll take a look at adding PayPal integration, connecting to a REST endpoint, and concluding our video course. In this video, 12.1, Add PayPal Integration, we're going to add PayPal integration to our storefront so that we can check out and purchase our items. Let's start out by cleaning a little bit of this up. If you notice when you click the checkout button, if you're not inside of the actual store, then you wouldn't see your checkout. So we're going to change that. Let's take the checkout out of the category, and we're going to go put it in the header. The header is always available, so we can make sure that we always have the ability to hit our checkout button and see the checkout dialog. Now that we have our checkout appearing when we want it to, is we're going to go into the packages and we're going to add our PayPal package. So let's go in here and we're just going to put MRT:PayPal. And that's the package that allows you to do PayPal within your application. So if we then go to our server and create a new file, we want to make sure that we keep our PayPal credentials on the server so that the users are unable to look at that. And here we're going to put Meteor PayPal, and then we're going to put, and we have to make sure that it's actually uppercase, we're going to put the config here. So inside of the config, we give it the host, and that's api.sandbox.paypal, And there's different URLs for testing and things like that, which you'll find all of that out once you sign up for a PayPal account and you get a client ID and a client secret. So you put the client ID here and the client secret here. Obviously, I am not going to put one of those here, but for the moment, we're just going to use this to set it up. So here we see we have our 4 parameters that PayPal needs to be configured. And now we can go in, and this package actually supplies already a template for doing the entire checkout process. So what we'll do is go right inside of the middle of our panel here, and we'll just put a call out to the PayPal dialog. So we have a PayPal credit card form is what that's called. And when you place that in here, then when we go and click our checkout button, we're going to see now that we have the name on the card, the type of card, expiration date, all the stuff that you need to do that checkout. So we still need to handle the form. So what we're going to do is in the JavaScript for the checkout, we're going to go in and put the information that's required to do that. So let's just go in and say template.paypal credit card form. Remember, that was the form that we used to do this. And then in there, we're going to put it in events. So we'll say that when the form is submitted, so submit, and the form name ID is PayPal payment form. And then in the return function for that, we're going to put our event in our template. And then here, we're just going to say, let's prevent the default action on the template, which is to just submit the form. We're going to say the card data is equal to, and then we'll go to the template and get the PayPal, credit card form and the card data. So this function will actually return all of the data that was in that form. So then we can use that and call meteor.paypal.purchase, and in there we would put any parameters like the card data, and then we could pass in like a total. And here I'll just hard code this right now for $10, but obviously we're going to want to get that and populate it with the actual data. And then we'll say that the currency is US dollars. So by doing this, we're setting it up so that clicking on the submit of the form is going to send this off to the PayPal with all the parameters that were entered. And if there's an error, we want to just put that in the console for now. And if there is a response, then we'll just say console of the response for now, the results. So we need to make sure that our function is going to give us an error and results. So we'll go ahead and put that here in the callback function. So then if we go back to our cart, one thing that we can do is set a session variable when we create the total of like cart total, and then we'll put in the total there. So now we have the total accessible to us. So when we go back into our JavaScript, we can actually change this to say, that if the session get, and we'll say cart total, and that should be a number if we're going to compare it to 0. So let's just make sure that it's going to be a number, and we'll put number around that, and that will return a number. And we'll say if that's greater than 0, then obviously, there's an amount to send to PayPal. Otherwise, if it's just 0, we have no reason to try to charge the card. So then here, if it's greater than 0, then we'll use that session variable, the cart total, to send off to the purchase. So here we'll replace the 10 with session get cart total, and then we know that when we submit this, it's going to submit it for whatever amount they have in their cart at that time. So the next thing that we can do is go into our template, and just below this checkout section, we can put the actual total so that it appears on the form when they're checking out. And you can format this however you want to, but the point here is that we'll make sure that we have a helper, which is the cart total, and all we're going to do is return the session variable, which is cart total, And basically what that means is that now cart total should appear on our checkout form. So once we refresh this and we go to our cart, still trying to refresh here, and hit checkout, we see up there that it says 134. Now we probably want that to look like currency, so we'll just go ahead and put, inside of the template itself, we already have a helper for currency, so we'll just put currency. So then currency cart total, and that will make sure that this appears as, in a dollar amount at the top of our form. So what we'll do now is go back into our form and just take a look at this, and we'll see that in the checkout window that we have, $134, and then you could fill in all your information, and basically you're able to check out with that. So the next thing that we'll do is just clean this up a little more. Since the name in the cart is kind of truncated and we really don't need an image there, basically we took out the image and we're going to replace that with at least 25 characters so that we can fit quite a bit more of the description there. And then in our string helper, what I want to do is I don't want this dot 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 unless the value or the length of the string is longer than our permitted amount. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and say if the input text is greater than the string length. So we'll take the length of the input text, compare it to the string length, and if it's bigger than that, then we want to do this stuff in between. So, and we'll actually declare this shortened in front of that. And so then we can say shortened is equal to this. And now we could say else and then say that shortened, is equal to the input text. But there's a better way to do that, which is to actually, instead of doing this, we could just take off the else statement and declare that shortened is equal to the input text up here in the beginning. So we'll say shortened is equal to the input text. We'll get rid of the else statement because we don't need that any longer. And then basically, if it's greater than the length of the string permitted, it will return a shortened value. So we see the entire description now is in the cart. So it says apple crisp and almost paradise. So that will complete our PayPal integration. Let's move on to the next video, which is connecting a REST endpoint. This is video 12.2, connecting to a REST endpoint. In the previous video, we covered PayPal integration. In this video, we'll be pulling categories from a REST API. In some cases like this category, you may have the categories stored in another location where you'd like to pull them in from. In my case, I'm going to go to a Tomcat server, which is serving up a REST API. So here we see that I have 4 objects in an array, and each one has a description. I'd like to use those descriptions to create new categories within my storefront. So what I'm going to do is in the Meteor startup function of the server, I'm going to create a variable, and that variable will be an array. So we're going to say it's external data, and it is equal to Meteor HTTP call, and then we're going to give it the method, which is a get method, and the URL where we plan to retrieve the data from. So that should return to us a JSON array with the starting node of rows. So we're going to use underscore to loop through that array, and we're going to say for each external data.data.rows, and then we'll give a callback function. And in that function, we're going to give the object returned and the index. So then inside of there, we can say Meteor, and we're going to call another function, which is the one we use to add categories. So if we go look at our categories, we see there's an add category method. It takes a category object. So we're going to go back to our startup function, and we're going to say call, and we'll put this in quotes, add category, and then we're going to create a JSON object as the object to be passed in. We'll give it a name, and then we'll say that that is the mat.description, which should be each one of those descriptions returned by our JSON REST service. So By doing this, our startup function is now going to automatically add all of those that it finds on that URL. Now here we do need to make sure that there's a package called HTTP within Meteor, otherwise that won't work. And then once we start the application up, we should be able to go take a look and see that our new categories have been added. So that completes this video on connecting to a REST endpoint. In this section, we added PayPal integration as well as connecting to a REST endpoint. Let's move on to our last video. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking this journey with me, and I want to go over some of the common mistakes that you might find in your project. The first problem that I'd like to go over is template selectors. Oftentimes when a user is trying to get to a particular variable in their template, they'll put the wrong selector. So, if you take a look at this product.javascript file, we see that we have an event handler here for a class of button product. And that is defined by the dot in front of the name. So basically that's saying wherever you have a element with a class of btn-product and someone clicks on it, then run this function. Well, in some cases, what we'll find is that the user will put the identifier for an ID instead of the class or vice versa. So it's real important to make sure that you know that you're in the right template product, and that matches up with the template name at the top of the template. And then you can also make sure that the event handler is accessing the correct element. So if we look inside of our project, we see a button product class on this button. Now, if you were to change this, you could change it and say, I don't want to use the class, I want to use an ID. So then you could say, for example, ID equals, product button. And then, all you would have to do is make sure that your event handler is now accessing with the, # product button. And so now we're getting that same exact element, but with the ID instead of the class. So pay close attention to how you're accessing these elements when you're doing your event handlers or your helpers. The same is true when you're trying to access parameters from within a template. So oftentimes, if you have to fill out a form, then you need to pull some of those parameters from the form. So here in this example, we have the product name, which is looking into the template and finding where the ID is equal to product name, and it's in the admin template. So it's important that you get this right, that it's not the class, it's the ID, and you know that in the proper template, so in this admin template, there is an element with an ID of product name. And then you'll know that you're getting the correct data. If you find that you're not getting anything back for the product name, it's likely that you didn't include the proper selector, or you're not asking for the dot value. Another point which can get confusing inside of Meteor is this idea that you're publishing a query, cart find, and then passing in a user ID, but then again in your template, you need to declare in the JavaScript file another query to cart.find. And the reason for that, of course, is that when you publish something, you're saying this is limiting the data set to this data. And then the user can query any of that data that they want to. So what we'll do is we'll typically subscribe to a publication, which is a subset of all of the data. And then from that publication, you allow the user to query any way they want. Another common mistake that I find a lot of users make is this idea that the template name is not being used properly. So when you have a template name like cart, then you need to make sure that you have helpers and event handlers for template.cart. And so that name is basically the same name that you're using in your template. And it's important to make sure that you get that right. Otherwise, you won't see any of your events getting handled, or you won't see any of the helpers appearing in your template. Whenever you're using external packages, it's important to make sure you include those packages. Otherwise, you get all kinds of errors in the console, and oftentimes it's hard to understand what those errors mean. But let's just take out the PayPal package from here, and we're going to take a look at our console down below. So when we do that and modify the application, you'll see that soon after we've removed that, the application has a problem that it can't call config of undefined, which isn't very meaningful. But if you look a little bit lower, you can see that it has to do with PayPal. And so it kind of gives you a hint that you may be missing a PayPal package or something to that effect. So if we were to go and add that back in again, you'll see that the application starts to act normal once again. Another problem I run into oftentimes is I'll forget the return statement, or I'll see that a user forgets the return statement. And while it seems trivial, if you don't actually return a value from these helpers, then basically the value will never appear in your template. So you feel like you've typed everything correctly, but when you go in and you look at the application, you see that it has no subtotal for this first item in the cart. And the reason for that, of course, is because I took out the return statement. If we go and put that return statement back into our code, we're going to see that this begins to once again appear in our cart. So whenever you are referencing a helper, you need to make sure that the helper returns a value. And so now once this updates, you'll see that the Apple Crisp has its itemized list of pricing and the $30 reappears. And on a final note, some of the problems that I've seen happen have a lot to do with permissions. Once you've removed the auto publish and everything, the security becomes a little bit tight. And so you need to make sure that you have these allow or deny statements in for each collection that you plan to secure. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the community buzz. There's quite a few things happening in the Meteor community which are now becoming forefront technologies. And I think you may be interested in looking into these a little bit further. So there's React and Meteor, and this is a new technology which combines Facebook's React front-end technology with Meteor's back-end server-side technology. And the two complement each other very well, so it's a nice framework to look into, and you may want to bundle that with your next Meteor project. You might also want to look into Google's Angular along with Meteor. The new relational database support that they're coming out with for things like Postgres and MySQL. You may also want to consider your application as a mobile app, and you can add the device for that, and there's quite a bit of documentation on Meteor's website for turning your application into a mobile app.
Once again, thanks for taking this course. I wanted to point you at a couple URLs that might be helpful to you. One is the Meteor docs. If you go to docs.meteor.com, you'll see both a basic and a full API documentation list. And inside there, you can virtually get to every function that Meteor supplies. Another one is Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow has a specific category, and if you go to Stack Overflow/questions/tagged and then Meteor, it'll get all the questions that were tagged Meteor, and you can usually go through here and find something if you're having difficulty. Another place to go is inside of the YouTube. There's a Meteor videos section. So if you go to YouTube/user/Meteor videos, you'll end up at Meteor's video page. And here they have several different instructional videos and things to introduce you to new technologies. So keep your eye on some of these URLs. I think all of them are useful. And this last one is the forums. So here's a place where all Meteor users tend to go and post any types of questions and vote them up and bring up any issues with everything. So here again are the URLs. You may want to write them down or bookmark them in your browser. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the Meteor community, and even more important, I'm looking forward to seeing what you've created.